These are real horror stories, disturbing, mysterious, and true. Each tale will send chills down your spine as you slowly drift into sleep. This story is completely free. We don't run any ads, which means we earn nothing from these videos. All we ask is one small favor. Please subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. It costs you nothing, but it gives us the motivation to keep creating more real horror stories every night. Also, tell us in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is right now. We love reading your messages. Now, let's begin the story. Story number 1. The old elementary school on the hill closed 3 summers ago, but long before the final class was dismissed, there was a custodian named Daniel who began to dread the night shift more than anyone knew. The building was not large, not one of those sprawling complexes with several wings and glass atriums. It was a squared, brick structure from the late 1960s, with low ceilings, buzzing fluorescent lights, and narrow hallways that smelled faintly of cleaner and chalk dust. Daniel had worked there for 8 years. He was the kind of person who preferred the late schedule, arriving as the last teachers were leaving, making small talk at the door, then starting his route with a rolling cart, a mop, and a practiced routine. He moved classroom to classroom, hallway to hallway, listening to an old radio clipped to his belt. That was how it had been night after night, with nothing more troubling than a light bulb that burned out or a sink that wouldn't stop dripping. It was early autumn when the first thing changed. The 4th grade wing was at the end of the longest corridor, a stretch of floor so polished that it reflected the overhead lights in a broken, wavering trail. At the very end of that corridor was room 12, a classroom that had always bothered Daniel for reasons he couldn't quite explain. The door was perfectly functional, the windows were intact, and the teacher who used it, Miss Riley, was known for being kind and organized. Still, there was something about the way the room felt when he stepped inside alone, as if the air had been waiting for him. On a Tuesday, when the days were just starting to shorten and the evenings became a little cooler, he finished mopping the hallway outside room 12 and reached for the knob. The door did not budge. He frowned, tried again, and checked the key ring hooked to his belt. The key for room 12 had a small piece of blue tape wrapped around it. He had used it hundreds of times. It slid into the lock and turned without resistance, but when he pulled on the handle, the door stayed solidly in place. He leaned his shoulder against it, careful not to scuff the paint. Nothing. From inside the room, there was only silence. Assuming that Miss Riley must have locked it from the inside somehow, maybe the latch was stuck, he made a note on his clipboard to ask the principal about it the next day, and moved on. There were plenty of other rooms to clean. The next night, the door opened with no trouble at all. That was not unusual in itself. Sometimes a stubborn lock simply decided to work again. Daniel pushed the door wide and stepped into the classroom. The faint scent of crayons and paper settled around him. Desks stood in neat rows, each with a name tag carefully taped in the upper right corner. A bulletin board showed colorful autumn leaves bearing words like respect, responsibility, and kindness. He moved through his routine, empty the small trash cans into a larger bag, wipe the whiteboard, run the vacuum in slow, even lines across the thin carpet. He was halfway through vacuuming when he noticed that the far window was open. It rose just a few inches from its sill, enough to allow chilly air to slip through. He distinctly remembered closing every window in the building earlier that week after a storm warning, and teachers rarely opened them afterward. The evening breeze rustled the corner of a poster. He turned off the vacuum. The hum faded into silence, leaving the soft hiss of air from the vents and the distant clank of the boiler. The window's lock was unlatched. He slid it shut until it clicked and tugged lightly, ensuring it held. Then he turned the vacuum back on and finished his work. That should have been the end of it. An open window was nothing to dwell on, but the next night, the window was open again, in the same narrow way, as if someone had slid it up carefully, no more than needed. Daniel closed it once more, this time checking the metal latch twice. He stood for a moment, looking at the row of small chairs, the books stacked on low shelves, the bin of sharpened pencils on Miss Riley's desk. Everything was still except for the thin curtain near the window, which no longer moved now that the gap was sealed. He rolled the vacuum cord, turned off the lights, and pulled the door shut. At the end of the hallway, as he pushed his cart away, he heard the quiet click of a door closing. He stopped. The hallway was empty, lined with closed doors on either side. The clock above the water fountain read 9:42 p.m. Most evenings, no one remained in the building by then, except him. The principal left on the dot at 5. Occasionally, a teacher stayed until 6, maybe 7, but they always called out a goodbye down the corridor before leaving. He listened, holding his breath. Nothing followed the sound. No voice, no footsteps. Just the low, constant hum of the building at night. The next evening, he approached room 12 with a growing, reluctant curiosity. The door stood slightly ajar. A thin line of darkness split the frame. That was not how Miss Riley left her room. She was careful, particular. Daniel knew her habits by now. Her chairs were always tucked in. Her desk was always straightened. Her door was always locked, and the keyhole was always aligned directly vertical when he arrived. He pushed the door open. The room greeted him with stillness. Every desk was in place, every chair aligned. The window was shut. On Miss Riley's desk, however, lay something that had not been there before. A piece of paper, slightly yellowed, lay under the lamplight. The overhead fluorescents were off this time. Only the small desk lamp glowed, casting a warm circle around the object. Daniel approached cautiously. It was a class photograph, one of those old-style group pictures taken on the playground, with children standing in 3 neat rows. The date at the bottom read 1989, 1990. The teacher in the center wore a patterned blouse and a wide smile. The children around her grinned or squinted, some with missing front teeth. He did not recognize any of them, though that was no surprise. Students cycled through the building yearly. The faces changed, the walls stayed the same. What puzzled him was why the photo was there at all. It was not in a frame, not pinned to a board, just resting flat on the desk, waiting. He reached out and lifted the picture. The small, printed faces seemed to watch him. The school behind them looked almost the same, only the playground equipment in the background was older, faded metal instead of the newer plastic structures installed a few years ago. He studied the teacher's name written in cursive under the date. Mrs. Hartley, room 12. He had never heard of her. The teacher's lounge had plaques and old photos on one wall, showing previous staff members, but Daniel did not recognize this woman. He placed the picture back on the desk, careful to leave it as he had found it, turned off the lamp, and started his cleaning. While he vacuumed near the front row, he heard it for the first time. A faint tapping, like the quiet patter of fingers on a desk. He paused, thinking the vacuum might be rattling against something, but the sound did not match the machine's rhythm. It came from the back of the room, near the windows. He powered the vacuum off. The tapping stopped. The room sank into silence again. He waited, his hands resting on the handle, skin prickling along his arms. After several long seconds, when nothing else happened, he told himself that old buildings make small, random sounds. Temperature shifts, unsettling beams, loose fixtures, these were normal. He turned the vacuum back on and finished the room. That night, as he locked the main doors and stepped out into the cool air, he told himself he was not imagining things. But the word imagining stayed with him all the way home. The pattern continued. On Wednesday, the window in room 12 was, once more, open a few inches when he arrived, though he was entirely certain he had left it locked the night before. The photograph appeared in different spots. At the edge of the teacher's desk, propped against the pencil holder, leaning on the base of the lamp. He never saw it move. It was simply always in a slightly different place when he entered. The tapping, at first so faint he thought it was his own heartbeat, began to sound more like the rapid, impatient drumming of small hands. Sometimes it came from the back row of desks, sometimes from one corner, sometimes from 2 directions at once. Always, when he stopped to listen, it ceased. Daniel tried to bring it up once to the assistant principal in a casual way, mentioning odd sounds and a stubborn window. She smiled, thanked him for his work, and made a joke about the friendly ghosts of past students. He chuckled along, but felt no comfort. The Friday before a long weekend, the building emptied faster than usual. By 4:30, only a few teachers remained, and by 6, their cars had disappeared from the parking lot. Rain clouds rolled in, pressing dark and low above the school. On nights like that, the school felt like its own small island, lit from within, surrounded by a world of shadow. Daniel began in the gym, as he always did before a break. cleaning thoroughly so that after the long weekend, there would be no stale smell of sweat or scattered debris. Time moved steadily forward as he swept, mopped, and buffed. By the time he reached the fourth grade wing, it was close to 9. The hallway leading to room 12 was darker than usual. Several of the ceiling lights flickered, casting hesitant, uneven strips of illumination along the walls and floor. He made a mental note to report the issue, then pushed his cart toward the familiar door. It stood wide open. The light inside, however, was off. He remained in the doorway for a long moment, staring into the dim outline of desks and chairs against the faint light coming in from the hallway. Usually, he turned the light on immediately. That night, for reasons he could not quite explain, he didn't. Instead, he stepped in slowly, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The window at the far wall was not open this time. It was fully shut. The curtains were still. Something else, though, had moved. The desks, which always sat in orderly rows, now formed a rough circle at the center of the room. Each chair pushed inward, as if whoever had last been there had sat facing an empty middle. Daniel's heart gave a small, quick jump. He had been the last one in this room the previous night. He had left the desks perfectly aligned. No teacher had been in since. There had been no after-school meetings scheduled in that wing. No clubs, no events. A faint sound touched the air like whispering, but not words. More like the quiet rush of pages being turned in the distance. Instinct told him to back out and switch on the lights. Instead, he stepped closer to the circle of desks, drawn by something he could not name. On the floor in the center, lying alone on the gray carpet, was the old class photograph. It was turned face down. Daniel knelt, his knees pressing into the carpet, and hesitated. The sound of rain against the windows joined the quiet hush in the room. A soft patter that almost disguised the noise of his own breath. Slowly, he reached out and flipped the photograph over. The image was the same. 23 children, 1 teacher, the old version of the playground behind them. Their faces were as he remembered, but his gaze caught on something that had not been there before. On the far right of the second row, a boy who had been smiling in the picture on Tuesday now wore no expression at all. His mouth was straight, his eyes slightly off to the side, no longer looking at the camera. He appeared to be glancing at someone just out of frame. Daniel stared at the tiny printed face, blinked hard, and told himself that memory was unreliable. He could have misremembered the boy's smile. The brain fills gaps with what it expects. That was what he had read once in a magazine. Still, the unease grew. He returned the photograph gently to the floor and stood. The whispering hush seemed a little louder now, like many small breaths drawn at once. He reached toward the wall and found the light switch. The fluorescent lights flicked on with a soft buzz. In that instant, the whispers stopped. The desks were back in their rows. He looked around, heart pounding, the vacuum forgotten behind him. Every chair tucked in, every name tag straight. The photograph that had rested on the carpet now lay on the teacher's desk, exactly where he had first found it days earlier, neat and undisturbed. The room smelled faintly of something he had not noticed before. Old paper and chalk, like the scent of a classroom that had not been used in decades. The next week, he took a different route. He started on the opposite side of the building, delayed his arrival at the fourth grade wing, found excuses to linger in the lobby or the cafeteria. Still, the night always drew him back to room 12. It was part of his job, part of his checklist. Ignore one room and it would show. Dust would gather, trash would overflow, and someone would notice. On Wednesday, he decided, he would walk in, clean, and walk out without pausing, no matter what the room felt like, no matter what the photograph did. No more staring, no more listening, just work. He approached the door with a firm grip on his cart. It was closed again, properly. He fitted the blue-taped key into the lock and turned. The knob moved easily. The door swung open. Every light in the room was on. The overhead panels glowed. The desk lamp shone. Even the small lamp on the counter near the sink was lit. The air felt warmer than the hallway, as if the heat had been turned up only in this one space. At each desk, a single chair was pulled out a few inches, the way a person leaves a seat when standing briefly. There were no people. For the first time since he had started working there, Daniel considered simply backing away and pretending he had never opened the door. The rational part of his mind protested. Faulty timers on the lights, he told himself. A teacher could have come back for something and forgotten to turn them off. The chairs, well, he could have imagined them all being perfectly tucked once upon a time. Memory changed things. It played tricks. He stepped in. As the door clicked shut behind him, the old building's sounds seemed to fall away. No distant hum from other wings, no clank from the boiler room. There was only the buzz of lights and the soft rush of air through the vents. Something caught his eye. On the board at the front of the room, someone had erased most of the math problems Miss Riley had left that afternoon. In chalk, faint but clear, 3 words had been written in a child's uneven hand. "Please clean up." He stood very still. The chalk was fresh enough that a small dusting of white powder lay on the chalk tray below the message. The eraser rested nearby, its edge coated in residue. Daniel swallowed, the sound loud in the quiet space. Cleaning was exactly what he did, of course. It was his job, but there was something different about seeing those words in a place that should not have been touched after hours. He forced himself into motion, moving quickly down the rows, gathering trash, straightening chairs. He avoided looking at the board. He avoided the teacher's desk. Halfway through emptying trash cans, he knocked one over. Papers slid out across the floor. As he reached down to pick them up, a sound brushed past his ear, a brief, quiet giggle. It was not mean or mocking. It was the small, breathy laugh of a child who had seen something mildly amusing, nothing more. A moment later, another giggle joined it, this one more distant, followed by the faint scrape of a chair leg against the floor. Daniel lifted his head. The chairs were all still. Everyone. His hands trembled slightly as he stacked the scattered papers and jammed them back into the bin. The giggles did not return. When he finally forced himself to glance at the teacher's desk, the photograph was now propped against the pencil holder, facing the class. A faint reflection in the glassy surface of its print caught the light. He turned off the overheads, leaving only the desk lamp on. The room fell into a softer glow. That was when he noticed, in the reflection on the photo's surface, 23 small shapes seated in the desks, their outlines vague and hazy, like impressions left on a foggy window. He did not turn around to check. Instead, he spoke softly, though he did not know to whom. "It's time to close up," he said, voice low and steady. "Everyone should go home now." The air seemed to thicken for a moment, like the pause before someone decides whether to speak or stay quiet. Then the feeling eased. The sense of unseen eyes lifted. The next time he blinked, the reflection on the glossy paper showed only empty desks. After that night, Daniel changed his routine permanently. He started with room 12, moving through it quickly but with a strange kind of respect. He never moved the photograph more than he had to. When he closed the window, he said just under his breath, "It's chilly outside. Let's keep it warm in here." The tapping came less frequently. The giggles faded to an occasional, distant echo. Spring arrived. The decision was made to close the school after one more year and merge with a larger, newer building across town. Teachers packed their rooms into boxes. The walls slowly emptied of posters and artwork. Room 12 lost its autumn leaves and winter snowflakes, its math facts and reading charts, its colorful letter borders. On the very last night before the move, when everything was stacked and labeled, Daniel walked into room 12 for what he knew was the final time. The desks were gone, leaving only faint squares on the carpet where they had pressed down. The bulletin boards were bare. The whiteboard was wiped clean. On Miss Riley's empty desk lay the photograph. This time, it was in a simple wooden frame, polished and neat, as if it had always belonged there. The date at the bottom still read 1989, 1990. The teacher's name was still written in cursive. The children's faces were clear. He picked up the frame and studied it closely. In the second row, the boy whose expression had changed now smiled again, though his gaze remained slightly turned, as if looking towards someone in the front row. In the front row, where once there had been 8 children, there were now 9. The 9th child, seated on the far left, wore a janitor's uniform from decades earlier. The style slightly different from his own, the logo on the shirt faded. The man's features were soft but visible. Kind eyes, a tired mouth, a look that seemed both surprised and resigned. His hands rested neatly on his knees. He was not anyone Daniel recognized. Without explaining why, even to himself, he carried the frame down to the office. The principal, tired and busy with paperwork, thanked him absent-mindedly and placed it on a shelf. The old school closed that summer. Windows were boarded, doors locked, playground gates chained. People in town said they felt a little strange driving past it. As if it were listening, the building stayed that way for years, empty but somehow awake. Eventually, it was torn down to make room for something new. On the day the demolition crew arrived, one of the workers was tasked with clearing out any remaining items in the office. Files, old equipment, broken furniture. At the back of a dusty shelf, he found a single framed photograph, slightly warped at the edges but intact. It showed a class from 1989, 1990, gathered on the playground. 23 children, one teacher, no one else. The worker, not knowing what else to do with it, set the frame gently on the front steps of the school, facing out toward the street. For a moment, as he turned away, he thought he heard the faint echo of children's laughter drifting down the long, empty hallway behind him. It sounded, he would later say, not fearful or cruel, but relieved, like the release that comes when a long day finally ends and everyone is allowed to go home. Story number 2. Luis had never been afraid of empty buildings. He had worked security for years, malls after closing, office towers on weekends, a library once that was more dust than books. Out of all of them, the high school seemed like the easiest assignment. A modern building in a quiet town, rows of lockers, bright murals, polished floors, and a security office with more screens than he really needed. It was steady, predictable work. Walk the halls, check the doors, watch the cameras, fill out the log. 8 hours, 5 nights a week. Nothing strange had happened in the first 6 months. Not even the kind of small, half-explained things people like to exaggerate. No slamming doors, no moving shadows, no mysterious footsteps. The oddest thing was how loud the air conditioning could get at 2 in the morning. A deep mechanical hum that made the lockers vibrate if he leaned against them. Then, slowly, the building started to act like it remembered something. The high school was shaped like a wide E, 3 long hallways branching off a central spine. The main entrance opened into a high-ceilinged foyer with the school's name in big metal letters and a trophy case full of shining cups and framed team photos. The security office sat just off that foyer, a windowless room with a solid door and a bank of monitors mounted on the wall. On an average night, Luis started his shift at 10. He signed in, checked the radio, flicked through the cameras to see if any lights had been left on, and walked the first round. The janitorial staff usually finished by 11, after which it was only him in the building until morning. One Tuesday in late winter, he noticed something small on the monitors as he came in. Camera 7, which covered the second-floor math hallway, showed a light on at the far end near room 213. That wasn't unusual. Teachers sometimes forgot. He watched for a moment, waiting to see if anyone crossed the frame. Nothing moved. The clock in the corner read 9:57 p.m. He made a note on his clipboard and headed up to turn it off. The hallway was empty, quiet in that muffled way schools get at night, every sound absorbed by closed doors and soft bulletin boards. His footsteps echoed lightly. As he walked, motion sensors sensed his presence and turned small ceiling lights on ahead of him, then off behind, as if the building were blinking slowly. The light at the far end, however, was no longer on. Room 213's door was closed and dark. He tried the handle. Locked. He peered through the narrow glass cutout in the door and saw only rows of desks and the dim outline of a whiteboard. No glow from lamps, no computer screen left active. He shrugged, turned back, and chalked it up to his eyes. The monitors weren't perfect. Sometimes they held onto an image for a second too long. Sometimes light looked brighter than it really was. He walked his round, returned to the office, and settled onto the old swivel chair. On the screen, camera 7 showed the hallway he had just walked. Lights dormant, doors closed. At 10:24 p.m., the light near room 213 came on again. Luis frowned and leaned forward. The tiny digital timestamp in the corner kept scrolling steadily. He checked the building automation panel beside his desk. The scheduled lighting for that hallway had been set to night mode at 9 p.m., which meant only motion sensors should trigger individual fixtures. Something was moving up there then. Mouse, maybe. Some schools had that problem. He watched for several minutes. The camera, fixed high in the corner, stared silently down the length of lockers and closed doors. No shadow passed, no blur stepped into frame. Just that one light, stubbornly bright. He sighed, stood up, and went back. This time, when he turned the corner into the math hallway, the light was off before he was halfway there. Nothing scurried across the floor. No door clicked shut. He checked room 213 again. Locked. Dark. Inside, the faint outline of a motivational poster about algebra fluttered slightly in the draft from the vent. By the time he reached the office once more, he'd already decided to mention it to maintenance on his next report. Possible? Faulty motion sensor? Camera 7 area. Simple enough. He sat, rolled his shoulders, and glanced at the wall of screens. The light on camera 7 blinked on and stayed on. That was the beginning, though he didn't know it then. The weeks that followed brought small, almost unremarkable glitches. A door that showed as open on the sensor panel but was closed when he checked it. The faint echo of a class bell 3 hours after midnight, though the main bell system was shut down at night. Announcements over the PA system that never quite formed words, just brief bursts of static that sounded, if he was very tired, like someone clearing their throat. Luis noticed, because noticing was his job. But he didn't think about it much beyond jotting notes and calling for repairs. The cameras, though, were harder to ignore. One Friday, around 1:30 inches the morning, Luis sat in the office with a thermos of coffee cooling by his elbow. The building was settled into its deepest quiet. Outside, the parking lot lamps cast pale circles onto patches of frost. Inside, the heating ticked softly in the walls. He flipped through the cameras, more out of habit than concern. Foyer, empty. Cafeteria, dark tables, chairs stacked upside down. Gym, polished floor, the faint glint of basketball hoops. Library, rows of shelves, exit signs glowing green. When he reached camera 12, which watched the main science hallway, he paused. The feed was in color, but everything on it had a slightly washed-out tone, like an old videotape. Students moved along the hallway in both directions, backpacks slung over their shoulders, some in clusters, some alone. A teacher stood with a clipboard near the door of Lab 317, talking to a small group. Lockers opened and closed. A poster on the wall flapped slightly as someone brushed past. Luis checked the time. 1:32 a.m. He looked back at the screen. A boy in a hoodie bumped shoulders with another student, laughing. Two girls leaned against the lockers, talking rapidly, hands gesturing. A stack of textbooks teetered in someone's arms as they hurried. He stared, waiting for the image to freeze, expecting some kind of overlay label that said, Archive, or Playback. Nothing appeared. The timestamp continued to count the present seconds with quiet indifference. His hands, without his permission, had gone still on the edge of the desk. He switched to the camera beside it, camera 13, which covered the same hallway from the opposite end. Camera 13 showed the science hallway as he knew it should be. Dark, empty, silent. He flipped back to camera 12. Students kept walking. The teacher near lab 317 checked a watch and clapped hands, ushering the last stragglers inside. Someone rolled a cart of beakers past, the glass clinking softly. Luis watched, feeling a coolness spread from his chest outward. He checked the camera label again. Hallway. Science East. Cam 12. No mention of any playback mode. The digital recorder beneath the monitors showed no indication. It was running stored footage. The only sign that anything was wrong was how his own reflection, faint in the glass of the monitor, looked a little too pale. After a full minute, the stream of students began to thin. Locker doors closed. The hallway emptied. The teacher stepped into lab 317 and pulled the door mostly shut. The overhead bells were silent. Luis realized he hadn't heard any ring, despite the change of classes. The quiet was complete. Then, gradually, the picture faded, like fog lifting. The colors brightened into their normal tones. The hallway on camera 12 became identical to camera 13, a long stretch of gray-blue floor, locked doors, no movement at all. The time read 1:35 a.m. Luis sat back, heart knocking once, hard, He decided not to go up there. It felt like a strange choice for a security guard whose job was to investigate unusual things. But something in him resisted the idea of walking into that hallway right then. The threat wasn't clear. No intruders, no alarms, no visible danger. Just a video feed that had shown... What? A delayed recording? A malfunction? A trick of the system? He pulled the maintenance binder from the shelf and flipped through pages until he found the section on the camera network. There was no direct mention of any hallway playback feature. There were references to test modes, calibration patterns, internal review, but nothing that described what he had just seen. He wrote an incident report anyway, as neutral as he could. Cam 12 displayed student traffic between 1:32, 1:35 a.m. No actual building occupancy confirmed. Possible software glitch. It looked reasonable on the page, like something a technician could shrug at. Still, when he pushed his chair back and stood to begin his 2 a.m. round, he found himself avoiding the science wing, telling himself he would cover it extra thoroughly in the next pass. By Monday, he had almost convinced himself it had been a test feed that someone had forgotten to disable. The IT department might say so. He would believe them, but the building had learned, by then, that he had noticed. And the next thing it showed him was harder to ignore. About 3 weeks later, on a night so windy the rooftop vents howled softly, Louis sat in the office watching clouds move past the small, high window in the adjoining storage closet. It was 3:07 a.m., the deep middle of his shift. The monitors glowed in front of him. Most showed still, dark spaces, a few grainy views of doorways. The faint glimmer of an exit sign here and there. He sipped coffee, more out of habit than need. He was awake, mind-wandering, when Camera 5 flickered. Camera 5 pointed at the main foyer, just outside the security office itself. It was useful when he heard a noise and didn't want to step out right away. Now, the feed blinked, glitched into a line of static, and then resolved. The foyer looked normal. The trophy case reflected the security lights, and the double doors at the front of the school showed a faint view of the parking lot lamps. The janitorial cart, which had been left neatly against the wall hours before, sat where he remembered. He might have looked away, but something caught his attention. A line of text had appeared in the top corner of the screen, just beneath the timestamp. It was small, pale gray, and almost blended into the image. Period 1, 8:10 a.m. Louis squinted. The clock beside it still read 3:07 a.m. He watched. Nothing moved at first, just the empty foyer. Then, as if a curtain lifted, students began to spill into view. Some entered through the double doors, shoulders hunched against a cold morning he couldn't feel. Others came from the left and right, hurrying toward lockers or down the main hall. A cluster of band students with cases slung over their backs jogged past, laughing. The sound in the security office didn't change. The faint whir of the mini-fridge hummed. The ventilation sighed overhead. No footsteps. No voices. Nothing to match what his eyes were seeing. He leaned forward, his breath shallow without his noticing. A younger version of one of the current teachers, a history teacher he recognized from the staff ID board, walked through the foyer, hair a different style, clothes in an older fashion. She carried a stack of papers and a travel mug, her mouth moving as if humming. Two students bumped into each other near the trophy case, papers flying. One knelt to help the other gather them. A girl stood in front of the display, staring at the trophies with a look that was either longing or dread. The label period 1 stayed in the corner, flickering slightly. Luis glanced toward the real, physical foyer door, just beyond the office wall. He could picture it. Dark glass, locked handles. The echo of emptiness. The dissonance made his temples ache. On the screen, the first period bell must have rung, though no sound reached him. Students began to thin, moving off into their classrooms. The girl at the trophy case remained behind, fingertips on the glass. She drew a small pattern on it with one finger, an absent-minded swirl. Then, for the first time, one of the images seemed to notice something. The girl's finger paused. She lifted her head and turned, almost directly toward camera 5. Her eyes narrowed, as if trying to focus on something far away. Luis didn't move. The security office was silent. On the screen, she stepped one pace closer to the camera, gaze slightly up, which meant she was looking toward where the camera was mounted in the foyer. But the feeling that she was looking at him, in his chair, was strong enough to make the hair on his arms lift. Her lips moved. Just 3 syllables, from the shape of them. She said them twice. Then, slowly, the entire scene began to pale, like ink dissolving in water. As the foyer on camera 5 emptied of its morning crowd, the text in the corner flickered once more. Then abruptly it changed. Drill, evacuate. The timestamp stayed at 3:09 a.m. Down the long spine of the school, a faint sound began to travel. It was not the sharp blare of the actual fire alarm. It was softer, muffled, as if heard from several rooms away. A slow, rising tone, then silence. Rising tone, then silence. It moved along the hall, came close to the office, and passed, like a siren heard through thick walls. Luis stood, the wheels of his chair rolling back against the desk. He glanced at the alarm panel mounted near the door. No lights flashed. No alerts scrolled. On camera 5, figures appeared again in the foyer. They moved in quick, controlled lines, like students and staff, during a planned evacuation. A teacher in a bright vest held up a clipboard, directing them outside. The girl who had looked at the camera was among them. This time she did not pause. She walked with the others toward the doors. Luis's radio crackled suddenly to life, the static loud in the small room. He grabbed it. "Security to main office," he said automatically, though he knew the main office had been empty since late afternoon. Only static answered. The faint alarm tone flowed back along the hall, like water retreating. It grew quieter, then faded entirely. On the screen, the "none of this is happening" foyer emptied. The doors closed. The drill, evacuate label blinked and vanished, leaving only the time, still marching forward at 3 a.m. Luis looked from the monitor to the actual door of his office. His own reflection stared back from the small glass window in the upper half. Beyond it, the foyer was dark and still. He considered leaving then, walking out, locking the doors behind him, sitting in his car until dawn. But the idea of turning his back on the screens, of not watching what the building chose to show him, felt worse. For the next several nights, he watched more carefully. Sometimes, around the same hours, the cameras would briefly show that washed-out, busy version of the school. Classes changing, students rushing, teachers chatting. The feeds always stayed silently contained within their frames, like small recurring memories. He began to recognize patterns, like where certain students always paused, which teachers walked in a hurry, how a particular custodian always checked the same fire door, tapping it twice. There was no full figure of a ghost, no transparent shapes drifting through walls. Everything looked solid, ordinary, and in the wrong time. He still did his rounds, still checked locks and windows. He forced himself to walk through the same hallways he had just watched, full of daytime life. The first few times, his chest tightened as he passed spots where he had seen people on the monitors minutes earlier. The silence felt almost loud there. On a Wednesday, while checking the arts wing, he paused at a display of photographs taken by the advanced photo class. Sunsets, portraits, sports shots, candid moments of school life. One picture made him stop. It showed the main foyer from a high angle, probably from near the ceiling, using a ladder. The large school crest on the floor. The front doors. The trophy case. Students walked through the frame, slightly blurred with motion. Taped beneath, in neat handwriting, was the caption, "Between Bells, October 2011. He looked at the timestamp on the image, 8:12 a.m., and felt something cold brush his spine. That was almost the same time that had appeared on camera 5 during one of its early episodes. The same girl at the trophy case stood in the photo, mid-turn, her face partly obscured by the reflection on the glass. Luis stepped closer. The reflection in the trophy case, when he peered at it carefully, showed rows of seats from the auditorium, not the foyer behind her. But it might have been an artifact of the camera angle, an optical confusion. He told himself that and walked away. March edged toward April. On the surface, nothing in his job description had changed. He still unlocked the delivery gate at midnight for late drop-offs. He still filled out the same log sheets. All secure, building clear. But he had begun to understand that the school was doing more at night than simply sitting empty. The final night came without warning. A late spring storm moved in, wind slapping rain against the glass doors, lightning stumbling silently on the horizon. The building's lights flickered once around 11, then steadied. Luis checked the backup power readouts and found them normal. A few computers in classrooms rebooted themselves, according to the system logs. Nothing more. After the janitorial staff left, the halls fell deeply quiet. Rain softened against the roof. Somewhere in the distance, a loose sign squeaked rhythmically. At 2:43 a.m., the monitors all blinked black at once. It lasted only a second, maybe two. Long enough for the room to suddenly feel very small, lit only by the green glow of the alarm panel and the tiny light on his radio. Then the screens came back. Every camera, on every feed, showed the school as filled as it had ever been. Not just one hallway or foyer at a time, but all of it. Students bent over lab stations in the science wing. Librarians slid books onto shelves. Coaches paced the gym. In the cafeteria, tables were crowded with kids eating, talking, tossing things into the air. The arts hallway showed students painting, sketching, laughing silently. Sound did not arrive with the images. The office remained hushed, except for the thin patter of rain and the faint, steady ticking of the wall clock. Luis stood slowly, heart pounding. The sight was overwhelming, an entire day compressed into one moment across all the monitors. No labels floated in the corners this time. No period one. No drill. Just timestamps, all unified at 2:43 a.m. He stepped closer to the screens, one hand braced on the desk. In camera 5's view of the foyer, the girl at the trophy case appeared again. Hugo, the assistant principal, strode past, years younger, talking to someone out of frame. The main office door swung open as a parent stepped out, coat over one arm. The girl's gaze rose, unhurried, to the camera. But this time, she did not look like she was staring through glass. She had the direct, aware look of someone making eye contact with another person. Her mouth formed the same 3 syllables he had seen before, but now he could almost hear them, as if the memory of sound lived in the motion. It looked like, "Can you hear?" Behind her, through the glass doors of the school, the storm that raged outside now was absent. Instead, sunshine lit the parking lot. Marked cars lined in rows. A bus pulled in. Luis watched, his own breath loud in his ears. On a different monitor, in the science wing, a teacher gestured toward the fire alarm pull station during what looked like a drill, explaining something to a group of students. Their faces were intent. In the gym, another class stood in lines, practicing quietly congregating and dispersing at the sound of an unheard signal. Everywhere, people were rehearsing how to leave. A low sound began to tremble through the building, not from the alarms, but from the walls themselves. It reminded Luis of the day he'd toured a power plant on a school trip when he was a boy, the way the turbine's vibrations seemed to travel through concrete. He pressed his fingers lightly to the desk. It hummed under his touch. On camera 8, which overlooked the back stairwell, the feed flickered and shifted. Now it showed a date in the corner, superimposed over the normal timestamp. The numbers were vague, but he could see the year, more than 20 years ago. The stairwell in that image was lined with different posters, older paint. A sign on the wall bore the name of the old school that had once stood where this one now did. Students filed down the steps in pairs, some covering their ears. Teachers walked briskly. Smoke not thick, but a gray haze hung a few feet down from the ceiling in that old image. Lights glowed dim behind it. No one ran. They moved with the careful speed of a real emergency that someone had planned for but never wanted. Luis's throat went dry. He remembered then a story he had heard in passing during orientation, one he had not paid much attention to. This high school had been rebuilt after the previous building suffered a serious accident one night. An incident, the supervisor had called it, glossing over details. Fire in the old wing. Nobody on staff now was here for it. But that's why our evacuation drills are no joke. And that's why we invested in good systems. On camera 8, the smoke grew thicker. A teacher at the base of the stairs counted heads, eyes wide and serious. The label drill, evacuate, appeared for a heartbeat over the image, then glitched, half of the word dissolving into static. Dry. All at once, the low vibration in the walls stopped. The screens on the wall went flat gray for a breath, like eyelids closing. When they cleared, every camera showed only one thing: each lens fixed on its usual hallway, room, or entrance, but with that soft, not quite real smoke drifting lazily along the ceilings. It did not trigger any detectors. It did not set off alarms. It hung there, visible only through the eyes of the cameras. Luis took a step back, feeling the edge of the chair against his legs. In every frame, people began to appear, not the full crowds from earlier, but faint, semi-solid figures. Students and staff moved calmly toward exits, ghosted slightly, as if drawn over the current empty hallways. They passed through closed doors without moving them. Their feet made no sound. In the science hall, the teacher who had once stood by Lab 317 guided a small group in that same calm, urgent way. In the foyer, the girl at the trophy case walked backward for a few steps, facing the front doors, then turned as if deciding to go after the others. She paused beneath the camera. Very slowly, her head tipped back, and for the third time, her eyes met the view. Luis's radio, which had been silent since his last check-in, crackled with a burst of sound. "Exit the building in an orderly fashion," a voice said. It was thin, distorted, as if recorded long ago. "Do not use the elevators. Proceed to your designated..." The message cut off. On the screen in the foyer, the girl lifted one hand and pointed, not at the doors of the school, but to the right toward where the security office would be, just out of the camera's view. Luis realized he was holding his breath. His heart beat against his ribs like a fist. He forced himself to move. He grabbed his keys, his radio, his coat. He did not bother to shut down the monitors, did not turn out the desk lamp. As his hand closed around the office door handle, he hesitated and looked back at the wall of screens. In each frame, someone, student, teacher, custodian, turned their head toward the camera, just for a second, as if checking that someone was watching. Their faces were not twisted in fear or pain. They were focused, intent, doing what they had been taught. Then the cameras all flashed, once, like someone taking a picture. When the image returned, the building was empty on every feed. No smoke, no ghosted figures. Plain, dim hallways, quiet rooms. The time was 2:49 a.m. Luis left the office. The foyer outside was as he expected. Silent, the only light a faint glow from the exit sign and the spill from the security room. The glass in the trophy case reflected his shape, and beyond it, only rain against the doors. He walked to the main exit, key in hand, feeling every step. The air smelled faintly of dust and cleaning solution, nothing more. No smoke, no burning. But now, beneath those, he thought he could detect another scent. Chalk, old paper, the dry tang of a day long finished. At the doors, he turned the heavy lock, pushed, and stepped out into the wet night. Rain tapped his shoulders, cold and ordinary. Behind him, through the glass, the foyer lights flicked once and went out, leaving only the green exit sign glowing like a small eye. He stood under the overhang for a moment, looking back. Above the entrance, an electronic marquee displayed upcoming events during the day. Now, it should have been blank, the system was on a timer. Instead, the letters sputtered on in irregular patches, like someone learning to speak. For a few seconds, the words arranged themselves into a fragment. Drill complete. Then they scrambled into nonsense characters, twitched, and went dark. Luis didn't go back inside. He sat in his car with the engine idling until the first pale line of dawn showed behind the clouds. Only then did he drive home. He filed his report that morning, sticking to what could be written without sounding unwell. Camera system, malfunction. Possible playback of old evacuation footage. PA system, interference. The supervisor frowned, promised to have it look at it, thanked him for his vigilance. Luis requested a transfer within the month. The new guard who took his place heard only a brief, vague version of the story. The camera system bugs out sometimes at night, just call it. On his first solo shift, he sat in the same chair, in front of the same wall of monitors, listening to the same deep silence. At 3:15 a.m., he glanced at camera 5 and saw the foyer as it was. Empty, dim. The image froze for exactly 1 second. When it moved again, for that heartbeat of time, the reflection in the trophy case showed rows of lockers stretching into a different hallway, full of students between classes. A girl at the glass looked as if she were turning to say something. Then the present snapped back into place. The foyer was empty as ever. The new guard blinked and rubbed his eyes. He wrote nothing down. Some things, after all, are easier to let stay in the walls. The school carried on, humming and bustling by day, its nights guarded by cameras that sometimes seemed to remember. And every so often, in the deepest hours, one small label would appear in the corner of a screen and vanish before anyone could be fully sure it had been there at all. Drill. Evacuate. Story number 3. The auditorium had always been the heart of the school during the day, and the hollow of it at night. By daylight, the space was full of sound announcements, assemblies, band concerts, school plays. Students filed in and out, dropping programs, whispering, laughing in the dark, while a drama teacher hissed for silence. But when night fell and the doors were locked, the auditorium changed. The heavy curtains became deeper shadows. The rows of seats turned into ranks of watching shapes. The air took on the faint smell of dust and old velvet. Marissa, the new drama teacher, told herself that it was exactly the kind of place she wanted to be. She'd transferred to Ridgeway High at mid-year, taking over for a beloved teacher who had retired unexpectedly. The school had a decent theater program, a small but enthusiastic group of students, and a stage that was better equipped than most rigging, a light board, an old but serviceable sound system. The principal had welcomed her with a firm handshake and a warning that the budget was tight, but the expectations were high. She didn't mind. She loved theater because it made empty spaces feel alive. A bare stage could become anything if people believed in it for long enough. It didn't take long before she realized the auditorium already believed in something, even when no one was around. The first week, it was small things. She stayed late most nights, grading in the front row, writing blocking notes for scenes, or fiddling with the aging light board to see what still worked. The janitor for that wing, Mr. Coleman, made a point of swinging by around 9 to remind her not to stay too late. After 10, the building alarms arm automatically, he'd say, keys jingling against his hip. And the auditorium's on its own circuit. Doors will lock you in. She nodded, smiled, promised she'd be gone by then. On Tuesday, around 8:30, she stood on the stage with only the work lights on those low-wattage bulbs that cast a dim yellow glow over the boards, while the house stayed dark. She paced the space, barefoot in old socks, feeling for uneven spots that might trip an actor. Her script, marked up in different colored pens, lay open on a chair near center stage. Somewhere, faintly, a piano started playing. It was a simple melody, slow and careful. Marissa stopped walking and listened. The notes drifted down from above and behind, from the direction of the small music practice rooms on the second floor, past the balcony. The school's piano lab was up there. Someone must have stayed late, she thought. Maybe a student with special permission. The tune repeated, hesitant, then gained confidence. She didn't recognize it, but the chord changes had the wistful quality of an old song. She stepped to the lip of the stage and peered out into the darkened house. Only the faint red pinpricks of the aisle lights glowed. The exit doors in the back showed no slices of light from the hallway. They were closed. The music continued, a little louder now, as if the player had adjusted the volume. "Hello?" Marissa called. Her voice vanished into the curtains and high rafters. The melody skipped, like fingers slipping on keys, and then stopped. Silence dropped into its place, thick and sudden. The quiet seemed larger, because it had just been full of music. She listened for chairs scraping, footsteps, the sound of a door above the balcony opening or closing. Nothing. A few seconds ticked by. "Okay," she said softly to herself, shaking off a chill. "Practicing's over, I guess." She picked up her script and tried to ignore the feeling that someone else was listening. On Wednesday, it happened again. This time it was later, close to 9:30. She was alone, sorting props on a long table backstage, when the same tune floated down, one hand picking out the melody, the other adding quiet chords beneath. It was steady now, practiced. Marissa set down a plastic goblet and wiped her palms on her jeans. "Who's up there?" she called, more firmly. The music stumbled, stopped. After a moment, it began again, softer. She considered going up to look. The stairs to the balcony and practice rooms were just off the lobby, but something about leaving the stage, the place she knew, and walking into the unlit upper halls of a school she hadn't fully learned yet made her hesitate. It was probably nothing. A student with a key, maybe a band kid whose parent worked late. She'd mention it to the band director tomorrow. She went back to sorting props. When she turned off the work lights and stepped out into the lobby an hour later, the building's other noises pressed in, machines cycling, distant vents sighing, the faint buzz of the drink machine down the hall. The music wing was dark. The piano lab door on the second floor, visible from the atrium, was closed. She drove home that night with the melody stuck in her head. It followed her into sleep. The band director, Mr. Adams, blinked at her the next day when she mentioned someone using the piano lab late. "Nobody should be up there after 6, he said. "I lock it myself," he chuckled. "Unless you've got a ghost who knows its scales." She smiled, but the answer sat uneasily with her. By the end of the second week, she knew the auditorium schedule. It did its strangest things when the rest of the school was at its quietest. On Thursday, as a storm rolled in and rattled the auditorium's high windows, she tried out some new sound cues. The house lights were off. Just the glow from the stage and the small bulb above the soundboard lit the room. Rain tapped steadily, a distant curtain of noise. She played with a thunder effect on the ancient speakers, matching it to the real weather, amused at the coincidence. Kids would love this during the show, she thought. Nothing like a little rumble under their feet. When she cut the sound, though, a whisper stayed behind. It was so soft she almost missed it. A low murmur like voices several rooms away, weaving in and out of each other. She frowned and took off her headset, listening. The storm growled outside. The vents exhaled. Somewhere in the backstage area, a rope creaked lightly against its pulley, and under that, the whispers lingered. Not words she could catch, but the cadence of them rising, falling, overlapping, pausing. The steady background rush of a crowd before a show. She leaned forward over the board and turned down every channel one by one until the sound system was effectively off. The whispering didn't change. It grew slightly louder instead, as if annoyed she was trying to push it away. It reminded her of the indistinct noise of students settling into seats during an assembly, the shuffle of jackets, the rustle of programs, the hiss of stage curtains as someone peeked through. Marissa stood, her chair rolling back an inch. The sound seemed to wrap around her, not coming from any one speaker or direction. "All right," she said quietly, not to anyone in particular. "Very funny." The murmuring softened, then slowly thinned out, like people losing interest. Within a minute, the auditorium was as silent as if it had never made a sound. She shook herself once, sat back down, and forced herself to keep working. That was the pattern. Something strange, then ordinary tasks. Weeks slipped by. Rehearsals ramped up. The spring showcase approached. The story started coming in sideways, from her students. "Did anyone ever tell you about the tech booth?" one of the lighting kids asked one afternoon, coiling cable. "What about it?" Marissa replied, stacking script copies. He shrugged. "They say the old director, the one before Mr. Barnes, used to sleep up there during show week. Fell asleep during a performance once, missed a cue. The fire curtain dropped in the middle of a scene." He grinned. "Total disaster." Another student chimed in. "My brother said there was some kind of problem a long time ago. Like, a real problem, not just a messed up show. That's why the new safety rules are so intense, yet no one could give details. Just vague mentions of something that happened during a play, and an unspoken agreement that now, everything ran by the book. Exits clear, cords taped down, props checked twice. The principal came to every dress rehearsal just to sit in the back and watch silently. One evening, a few days before opening night, Marissa stayed late to finish painting the last flats. Her students had gone home. The janitor had already given his usual reminder. 10 o'clock, Miss R., he said, pausing in the lobby. "Building locks on its own. If you get stuck, use the side exit by the band room. Alarm theirs. On a delay." "I know, thanks," she answered, brush in hand. By the time she stepped back to look at the finished backdrop, a stylized city skyline in shades of blue and black, the school clocks read 9:48 p.m. Her back ached pleasantly. The work lights bathed the set in a tired glow. From somewhere high above, the piano began its familiar tune. The first notes echoed slightly in the large space. Then more joined in. A second line of harmony, a bit bolder. Marissa stood on the stage, listening. The music was clearer than it had ever been, almost crisp. The melody wound itself around the beams and seats, She walked to the front of the stage and looked up toward the balcony. The rail there showed only darkness. The piano lab door above the lobby was a dull rectangle. "Whoever you are," she called, "you're going to get locked in if you don't head out soon." The song kept going, unconcerned. She waited. It didn't stop. Something about that made her uneasy. Before, the playing had always faltered when she spoke, reduced itself, retreated. Tonight, it seemed to have decided on its own tempo. The hairs on her arms rose slowly. "Okay," she muttered. "Enough." She hopped down from the stage and crossed the front of the house, heading for the side door that led to the lobby and the stairs. Her sneakers made small thuds on the carpeted aisle. The music followed her, not growing nearer or farther, just maintaining its presence like a calm, steady breath. Out in the lobby, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Posters for the show lined the walls. The security lights by the doors had already switched into their nighttime mode, glowing more brightly than the ceiling fixtures. She climbed the stairs to the balcony level. Each step squeaked a bit under her weight. The air up there was colder, touched by drafts from older windows. At the top, the corridor stretched left and right. On one end, the locked double doors to the balcony seating. On the other, around a bend, the entrance to the music practice rooms and piano lab. The tune that had been drifting down from above seemed now to be coming from everywhere, as if the hallway itself was humming. It bounced lightly off the walls, grew slightly out of sync, as if there were more than one player, each just a fraction behind the other. Marissa swallowed and headed toward the piano lab. The door was shut. A small glass panel near the top gave a sliver of view inside. She peered through. The lab was dark. 12 electronic pianos sat in neat rows, their lids down, cables bundled, benches tucked. A sign on the wall reminded students to sign in and out. Papers lay stacked neatly by the main keyboard at the front. No lights glowed on the instruments. No hands moved over the keys. Yet the music continued. The same melody, the same chords, now sounding as if it were between her and the far wall, unable to decide where to settle. Her breath fogged a pale patch on the small window. She watched it bloom and fade. Behind her, down the corridor, a soft clicking sound began, in time with the music. Not footsteps, but something like plastic, hitting metal regular, measured. She turned her head slowly. At the far end of the hallway, back toward the balcony doors, a metronome sat on the floor. It was the old wooden kind, with a swinging arm and a weighted bob sliding on a metal rod. It clicked back and forth, its tiny motion impossibly clear from that distance. Marissa had never seen it there before. She recognized it, though. There was one just like it in the prop cabinet backstage, used for a scene earlier that week. She'd put it away herself. The arm swung. Click, click. The sound matched the tempo of the piano music perfectly. She realized suddenly how quiet the rest of the building had become. Even the distant hums and rattles seemed to have dimmed, as if the school were holding its breath. "Fine," she whispered. "You win." She stepped back from the piano lab door and walked toward the metronome, heart thudding. As she approached, the clicking slowed, just slightly. The weighted bob dipped lower, like a heartbeat growing lazy. The piano music, which had been so steady, faltered on one note, as if whoever or whatever was playing had glanced away. She stopped an arm's length from the metronome. Up close, she could see a faint smear of old paint on one side, the same shade they'd used for a set piece last fall. It was definitely the drama department's prop. The metal arm swung once more, and then froze at the top of its arc, pointing toward her like a small, accusing finger. The silence that dropped was absolute. Something moved in the reflection of the polished wood. At first, she thought it was just her own distorted face. But the shape was too small, the outline of the shoulders too narrow. Another figure, faint and pale, seemed to stand just behind her in the glossy surface. A person in a collared shirt and dark skirt, hair pulled back, hands resting at their sides. They weren't in the hallway itself. If she turned fully, she knew, the space behind her would be empty. The image lived only in the gleam of the metronome's casing. She exhaled slowly. "Is this about the show?" she asked, the words feeling foolish and heavy in her mouth. The figure in the wood did not nod or speak, but the piano music started again, much softer now, like someone trying a tune under their breath. It took her a long time to move. When she finally bent down, she did not touch the metronome. She stepped carefully around it and went back downstairs. Not running, but not exactly walking either. The song followed until she reached the lobby, then faded, as if it were tied to that upper hallway. She turned off the auditorium work lights from the panel by the door and let the darkness slip in behind her like a closed curtain. The next morning, she opened the prop cabinet backstage. The metronome sat where she had left it weeks before, between a stack of fake books and a tin lantern. Its arm lay straight up, at rest. She lifted it, checked the base. There was the smear of blue paint, exactly where it had been on the one upstairs, or had that one been this one all along? She set it back carefully and shut the cabinet. That afternoon, during a break in rehearsal, one of the seniors lingered by the edge of the stage while the others scattered for snacks. "Hey, Miss R," he said. "You ever hear the old story about the dress rehearsal that never finished?" She looked up from her script. "No. Should I?" He shrugged, glancing at the dark house. People say one of the plays, a long time ago, like when my mom was in school, never got to open. Something happened during Tech Week. The director wouldn't talk about it, and they canceled the show. But some of the teachers say if you stay late up there," he jerked his chin toward the ceiling, "you can still hear the last scene being run. Over and over." His voice dropped. "My uncle swears he heard someone singing in here on a Saturday once, and no one was on stage." Marissa smiled thinly. "Well, maybe we won't give them anything new to add to the story." The showcase opened 2 nights later. Nothing dramatic happened. The lights worked. The cues landed. The actors remembered their lines, or at least covered when they didn't. Parents clapped. Students bowed. The principal shook her hand afterward, saying the program was in good hands. From the back of the house, in the shadows near the double doors, the faint silhouette of a woman in an old-fashioned skirt and blouse might have been seen, if anyone had been looking that way. Someone glancing back would likely have decided it was just a trick of the eyes. A shadow thrown by the balcony. A coat on a chair. When the run ended and the set was struck, the stage went bare again. Marissa still stayed late sometimes, but she learned the building's boundaries. She kept an eye on the clock. She stopped going up to the balcony alone. She left the metronome where it belonged in the prop cabinet, its arm folded down. On certain nights, when a storm rolled through, she would sit quietly in the front row for a few minutes before leaving, watching the faint outlines of the rafters and light bars above. If she listened hard enough, beneath the wind and the hum of electricity, she could almost hear a crowd breathing together, waiting. Every so often, very late, the stage lights would flicker once without reason, as if catching a cue that only they could see. And sometimes, just sometimes on the edge of hearing, a simple, careful piano melody would drift through the empty school, playing the same unfinished tune it had played for years, waiting for someone to call places and let the last scene finally end. Story number 4. The library was the quietest place in the school even during the day, and at night, it felt like the silence belonged to it. Ellen had been the librarian at Brookview Secondary for almost 25 years. She had watched rows of computers replace half the card catalog, watched glossy new paperbacks edge out cloth-bound classics, watched students change from whispering over reference books to hunching over glowing screens. Through all of it, the library had stayed her favorite room. It sat at the end of the central hallway, 2 stories of shelves and study tables with a narrow balcony running along the upper floor. Tall windows faced the courtyard. In the afternoons, they filled the room with soft light. In the evenings, when the rest of the school had gone dark, the library's overhead fixtures hummed warmly, and the place felt like its own small world. She liked staying late, especially on Fridays, when there were no meetings and no one knocked on her office door at the last minute asking to borrow a laptop. She could reshelve at her own pace, run reports, straighten displays. Sometimes she'd make a cup of tea in the tiny staff kitchenette, sip it at the circulation desk while the building settled. When the district announced that all the school libraries would be modernized over the next year, Ellen knew what that really meant. Less space for books, more for devices. They sent her a thick packet of guidelines with bright graphics and a long list of titles marked "Weed, Low Use." She was supposed to pull them, box them, and send them to a central warehouse. She didn't like it, but she understood it. Shelves couldn't hold everything forever. So on a cold Thursday evening in late January, she stayed after the last bell to start the job. The custodian, Manny, poked his head in around 6. "Heading out soon, Miss Marsh?" he asked, leaning against his mop. "In a little while," she said. "I'll be here until maybe 9. I have my key for the side door." He nodded. "I'll set the alarm for the rest of the building. Just remember, once it's on, these doors don't like to open again." He smiled, then vanished down the hall. By 7:30, the library was the only lit room on that side of the school. The glow from the tall windows reflected faintly in the dark glass. Outside, the parking lot lights burned in small, lonely pools. Inside, Ellen moved methodically along the 800 section. Literature, plays, poetry. The weeding list in her hand had columns of call numbers. She slid books off shelves, checked them against the sheet, and stacked them on a rolling cart. Some of the volumes had not been opened in years. Their spines creaked softly when she pulled them. Their pages smelled like dust and ink. She paused over one or two, remembering a student who had loved that particular author, or a teacher who had requested it for a project long finished. "You had your moment," she murmured once, tracing a faded cover. "Time to make room." She didn't turn on any music. The only sounds were the soft squeak of the cart's wheels, the occasional tick of building pipes, and the faint clatter from the heating system. About halfway down an aisle, she heard something else. A page turned. Not her own. Not the slight rustle of air when she moved a book. It was the distinct, weighty flip of a paper page being moved over and smoothed down. Ellen froze, listening. The sound came again, a little farther down the row. Then another, like someone leafing through a thick volume, not in a hurry. She stepped to the end of the shelf and peered around. Nothing. The next aisle was empty. The nearest study table stood bare, chairs tucked in. Her own cart waited where she'd left it. Maybe it was the ventilation, she told herself. Or a book sliding into place as the shelves shifted. Old wood, old paper. They all made tiny noises when the temperature changed. Still, she found her hands moving more carefully after that. When she wheeled the first full cart to the circulation desk and started scanning the barcodes to mark the books as withdrawn, the computer reacted more slowly than usual. The software progress bar lagged, then jumped, lagged, then jumped. On the third book, a notice flashed across the screen. Item already checked out. Patron, L. Rainey. Due date, the 4th of October 2093. Ellen blinked. The date's year sat strangely on the screen. 1993. More than 2 decades ago. It had to be an error. Ghost data in the system. She clicked Override and moved on. The next title registered normally. So did the next. 5 books later, the same message appeared again, but with a different name. Item already checked out. Patron, A. Mendez. Due date, the 22nd of May, 2001. She frowned. The system should have been purged of records that old years ago. The first automated migration had wiped most of the 90s circulation data. She jotted the names down on a sticky note, intending to ask the district tech the next time he stopped by. Then she continued. By 8:15, she had a second cart full. The library felt deeper now, its corners dimmer. The automatic lights in the hallway outside had cut off, leaving only the strip of brightness under the main door. She went to the back corner to start on the biographies. Names of authors stared back at her from thin spines. As she reached for a worn life story of a long-forgotten playwright, a faint whispering brushed her ear. She pulled her hand back. The whispering wasn't words she could make out, more a thread of sound, like someone reading aloud just under their breath. It seemed to float up from between shelves, a little higher than the usual murmur of the air vents. Ellen walked slowly along the aisle. The sound shifted slightly as she moved, always just ahead of her, never at her back. She stopped. The whisper stopped a heartbeat later. Echoes, she said aloud. Her voice sounded too loud. The building settling. She picked up the book and put it on the cart. The whisper began again, faint and steady, following some unseen line of its own. She lasted until exactly 9. Her eyes were tired. The stacks felt taller, hemming her in. When she rolled the final cart to the desk, she found a small slip of paper sitting on the keyboard. It was an old checkout card, the kind they used before barcodes. The school's name was stamped at the top. Below, in faded ink, several student names were written with dates. The last one had been scrawled in pencil and never inked over. L. Rainey, the 3rd of October 2093. The title printed on the card's bottom margin matched one of the books in her cart. Ellen stared at the card. She hadn't seen a physical checkout slip in years. She had boxed the last of them and sent them to storage when they went fully digital. She looked up slowly at the rows of shelves that disappeared into the upper floor's shadows. "Somebody's playing games," she said softly. Her own keys jingled faintly when she picked them up. She switched off the overheads, one bank at a time, until only the emergency exit signs and a few low safety lights remained. The library shrank into pockets of shadow and dimness. As she stepped out, she checked the door twice to be sure it locked behind her. The next morning, the first thing she did was look for the cart of weeded books she'd left by the desk. It was only half full. Several of the titles she remembered stacking near the top were gone. The space where their weight should have been was unmistakable. She turned slowly to the nearest shelves. There they Saturday. 3 of the older books, their faded spines neatly aligned with their neighbors, exactly where they had been before she pulled them. Ellen felt a small, unreasonable twinge of annoyance. "I took you out," she said under her breath. "I know I did." She reached up, tugged one down, and flipped through it. A thin layer of dust along the top edge, and a faint crease where the checkout card pocket had been removed years ago. Nothing unusual. She put it back on the cart. By that afternoon, 2 of them had returned themselves again. The pattern continued over the next week. Every time she pulled certain books, a handful from the biographies, a couple of older novels in the fiction section, a set of thin poetry volumes, they would be back on the shelves the next morning. They weren't always in exactly the same place, but they were always nearby, holding their spots as if they had never moved. Ellen double-checked her own steps, suspecting simple forgetfulness. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she'd only thought she had loaded them on the cart. Then she started noticing the names. One evening, when the students had gone and the hallway had dimmed, she pulled up the circulation software to run an inventory report. A separate tab on the screen flashed for a moment as the system synced with the district server. Brief, faint lines of text scrolled by. For a second, no more, she saw a message overlay the main window, as if it were typing itself. Patron records restored. Syncing unreturned items. Then it vanished. The inventory list appeared as usual. She opened the patron search box and entered the first name from her sticky note, L. Rainey. A record popped up that she had not expected to see. No student with that name was currently enrolled. The system should only have shown active users. It was a slim file. No photo, just a gray silhouette. Grade 10. Status inactive. Under notes, someone had typed, many years ago, moved out of district mid-year. Items not returned. Below, a list of titles scrolled down. All of them were books she had on her reading list now. All of them were older, low-use items. She hesitated, then clicked another name she jotted. A. Mendez. Similar record, different year. Same note. Items not returned. The clock on the monitor clicked over to 8:02 p.m. The library was empty. The air felt cooler around her ankles. From somewhere in the stacks, a book thumped softly to the floor. Her heart knocked once, hard. She stood listening. A few seconds later, another book fell. Then another, a bit farther away, the sound softened by carpet. The pattern was too even to be coincidence. Not a cascade, not an accident. One, then another, as if someone invisible were working through the shelves, pulling volumes out and letting them slip from their fingers. "Stop that!" Ellen called, more sharply than she meant. The quiet that followed was complete. She thought of Manny, maybe still making his rounds in another wing. She thought of calling out for him, telling herself she'd discovered a raccoon or something similar. But she knew, the doors and windows in the library, they stayed closed after hours. Nothing larger than a moth came through. She walked slowly between the aisles. 3 books lay on the carpet, one in biography, one in fiction, one in the far poetry shelf. Each lay open, their pages fanned, as if dropped mid-sentence. She picked one up. It was a novel from the late 80s, its cover worn. The chapter it had fallen open to was titled, Going Back. Ellen closed it gently and glanced at the others. A biography of a local teacher, long retired. A collection of poems about leaving home. She returned them all to the cart without another word. That night, she dreamed of the library. In her dream, the shelves were higher, stretching up into darkness. Students moved among them with flashlights, their faces blurred at the edges. They checked out books without coming to the desk, taking them off into the shadows. As they walked, their outlines faded, leaving only the shapes of the books in their hands. When she woke, the taste of paper and dust lingered in her mouth, as if she had spent the night reading aloud. The next Friday, she decided to stay even later, to see the weeding through. The district deadline loomed, and she wanted it done. Manny paused at the doorway at his usual time. "You're really putting in the hours," he said. "You sure you don't want me to wait for you?" "I'll be fine," she said, though she appreciated the offer. "I know the code for the alarm." He looked as if he might say something else, then just lifted his hand in a small wave and left. By 9:30, the only lights were in the library and the main entrance. The rest of the school lay in shadow. Rain had begun to tap lightly against the high windows, turning the glass into dark, moving mirrors. Ellen sat at the circulation desk with the last stack of books to scan. The overhead lights above the shelves had cut down automatically to their night level, leaving pools of gentler light and deeper gaps between. The computer beeped steadily as she moved each barcode under the scanner. Withdrawn. Withdrawn. Item already checked out. She paused. This time, instead of a name, the patron field was blank, just a long underscore. She clicked. Details. The screen filled with lines of text. Patron. Status. Unknown. Items. Multiple. Due. Below, a list unspooled. Title after title. Many she recognized as the stubborn books that reappeared on the shelves. A few she did not. At least, not at first glance. At the bottom, one more line typed itself, the cursor blinking as if someone else were controlling it. Overdue. 1. Patron. Marsh. E. Ellen stared at her own name. A dull thud sounded behind her, over by the return slot, as if something had been pushed through. Then a second, lighter tap, like a book dropping. She turned slowly. A single volume lay on the carpet near the cart, one she had not put there. Its cover was plain, without illustration. Just the school's name pressed into the cloth in gold lettering. No call number label on its spine. She stepped around the desk, picked it up, and opened it. The pages inside were blank except for faint stamps along the bottom corners. 1998, 2003, 2011, 2019. The years marched on, some smudged, some clear. In the center of the book, on one open spread, a fine, small handwriting covered the paper in neat lines. She did not recognize the handwriting, but she recognized the events. They were small things, each paragraph, a memory of a day in the library, helping a shy student find a book on astronomy, hosting a visiting author, staying late when a winter storm had canceled buses, and a handful of kids waited for parents, tucked into beanbags in the corner reading while snow drifted outside. It was, she realized with a strange, slow wave of understanding, a record, not of official circulation, but of moments, of borrowed time. On the last written page, the ink trailed off mid-sentence. Tonight, the shelves are. The pen stroke ended in a faint, uneven line. The quiet around her thickened. The rain seemed farther away. Somewhere in the stacks, a soft murmur rose, the same whispering she had heard before, but now more distinct. It sounded like dozens of voices, all reading at once, each on a different page. Ellen closed the book gently. "I'm not overdue," she said, her voice very calm. "I'm still here." The murmur faltered for a breath, as if listening. She walked back to the desk, the book in her hands. On the computer screen, the cursor blinked next to her name. The word overdue sat beside it like an accusation. She reached for the keyboard, but her fingers stopped just above it. Instead, she picked up the old checkout card she had left by the monitor days before, the one with L. Rainey's name on it. She studied the date, imagining a teenager more than 20 years ago hurrying out of the library with a stack of books, intending to bring them back and never getting the chance. "Some of them didn't return," she said softly. "I know." She set the card down on the blank book's first page and slid it into place, as if filing it where it belonged. "I'm not taking these away," she went on, though she wasn't sure who, if anyone, could truly hear. "You can keep them if you're so determined. I'll mark them as lost. No one will throw them out. The lights above the nearest shelves flickered once, then steadied. The murmur softened, like 100 people letting out a held breath. On the screen, the overdue notice beside her name blinked and changed. Status. Active. Due. The blank line under patron filled in, briefly, with a single word. Stacks. Then it cleared, leaving only the normal inventory window. Ellen stood for a long moment, hand resting lightly on the desk, eyes on the calm, ordinary grid of titles and barcodes. Behind her, in the dim of the stacks, a few books shifted softly on their own, sliding the tiniest bit closer together. She shut down the computer. The monitor's glow faded, leaving the library lit only by the overheads and the soft green rectangles of the exit signs. On her way out, she passed the biography aisle and paused. Her fingers ran along the spines of the stubborn volumes that had refused to be weeded. "You've been claimed," she said under her breath, not unkindly. "You can stay." The air felt lighter as she turned off the last bank of lights. The whispering had gone, replaced by the ordinary hum of the building at night. Months later, when the district review team came through with clipboards and checklists, they nodded approvingly at the library's new arrangement. More space around the tables. Fewer dusty, untouched books. More devices. A cleaner look. They did not notice that certain shelves remained stubbornly full of older titles, even though their usage reports showed 0 checkouts in recent years. When they asked about it, Ellen smiled and said she was keeping them for archival purposes. End of 10. The new assistant librarian, a young woman fresh out of college, took to staying late herself sometimes. She would send Ellen texts long after sunset. "Do you ever hear someone reading when no one's in here? Like, really late?" Ellen would reply after a pause. "Sometimes. They've always done that." One night, the assistant wrote back, "I found an old book with no title, full of blank pages and dates. Put it back and now I can't find it again." Weird, right? Ellen sat for a moment, thinking of the night the library had marked her as overdue. She imagined the shelves, alive in their silent way, keeping careful track of everyone who had passed through. She answered, "Just the library keeping its own records. Make sure you put things back where they belong." In the deep hours, when the rest of Brookview lay dark, the library stayed awake. Its shelves remembered. Its catalogs, hidden and digital and handwritten, kept lists no one else ever saw. Every so often, if someone walked those aisles alone, they might hear a single page turn all by itself, or a soft voice reciting a line from a book long out of print. Not everything checked out from a school library came back, but in this one at least, nothing was ever truly lost. Story number 5. The language lab had been new in 1983. By the time Adam started teaching at Crestview High, it was already something of a relic. It occupied a long, windowless room off the foreign language wing, 2 rows of small wooden carrels, each with a gray headset and a built-in tape deck that had been converted to work with the newer computer console at the front. The plastic was yellowed, the padding on the headbands cracked, but the wiring still worked. The district had never found the money to replace it, and as long as it functioned, it stayed. Most daytime classes preferred the portable laptops on carts, but for the small evening English course the school offered to adults in the community, the lab was perfect. It could be locked, lit separately from the rest of the wing, and its door opened directly onto the side parking lot. In theory, no one else needed to be in the building after dark. That suited Adam just fine. He was in his 3rd year of teaching, still young enough that people sometimes mistook him for a student in the hall. He taught English during the day to 9th and 10th graders. At night, twice a week, he ran the conversational English class for adults who worked long shifts and couldn't attend the usual programs. The extra pay helped. The night class, small and earnest, helped even more. After a day of teenagers rolling their eyes at grammar, it was a relief to sit with people who wanted to be there. On a drizzling Tuesday in November, he arrived just before 6. The rest of the building was already emptying. Custodians wheeled carts down long corridors, collecting trash and straightening desks. The main office lights were off. A security guard sat near the front entrance, checking a clipboard. "Night class?" the guard asked as Adam signed the register. "Language lab," Adam said, lifting the worn canvas bag that carried his books and laptop. "Same as always." "Good. I'll set that wing for occupied on the alarm," the guard said. "Rest of the building will go dark at 6:15. The hallways on the way to the lab already felt cooler. Motion sensor lights flicked on just ahead of him and off behind. The posters on the walls, maps, vocabulary charts, photos of landmarks looked flatter without students walking past them. He unlocked the heavy door marked Language Lab and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of plastic, dust, and the citrus cleaner the custodians used. The overhead lights hummed softly. At the front, the teacher console, an L-shaped desk with an old computer tower, and a console panel of switches and buttons waited under a laminated instruction sheet. Adam set down his bag, logged into the software, and watched as the digital map of the lab appeared on the screen. 30 small squares representing booths, each labeled with a number. A green outline pulsed faintly around them, showing they were ready. He had only 14 students enrolled. They usually spread out along one side of the room, leaving plenty of space between them. He checked his folder. Attendance sheets, lesson plan, vocabulary list. The first students arrived a few minutes later, letting in a breath of wet, cold air each time the door opened. They greeted him shyly, "Good evening, teacher," and took their places. A young woman from the bakery downtown, a bus driver, a grandmother who wanted to be able to talk to her grandson's teachers without her daughter translating. At 6 sharp, he closed the door and started the lesson. For the first hour, everything was simple and familiar. Greetings, introductions, questions, responses. They practiced repeating phrases into their microphones, listening to themselves, laughing softly at their own mispronunciations. The lab software let him listen in on any booth, patch pairs of students together, or play a recording for all of them at once. Occasionally, one of the headsets crackled, or a booth icon on the screen flashed amber instead of green for a second. Old wiring, he thought. Old hardware. He wiggled a cord here and there, and the signals steadied. During a short break, while his students poured coffee from the thermos they brought and spoke in quick, comfortable Spanish and Mandarin and Arabic, Adam sat at the console, scrolling through the software's options. The lab system had been installed long before he started at Crestview. The manual he'd been given was 3 versions out of date. The interface still contained features no one used: cassette controls, group call buttons labeled in abbreviations from brands that no longer existed. He clicked on a tab labeled Archives, curious whether any recordings from previous years still lingered there. A long list dropped down. Dates, file names, teacher codes. Most of them were grayed out, clearly already cleared, but a few near the bottom remained in standard text, as if they had never been marked for deletion. SESE on, Oct 12, Spanish 2, Teacher ID, R. McLean, Session, Nov 03, French I, Teacher ID, S. Grafton, Session, Mar 18, Esel Night, Teacher ID, blank. The last one made him pause. ESL Night, English as a second language. No teacher abbreviation. The date field beside it was empty. He clicked it out of idle curiosity. A small window popped up. Session open. Channels active. 1. He frowned. The system could sometimes show open sessions if the software hadn't closed properly, but that usually cleared at restart. These were old. This one had no year at all. He hovered his mouse over the single green circle that pulsed in the window. Booth 13. Teacher? A voice said behind him. We start again? He glanced up to see his students sitting back down, adjusting headsets, smiling uncertainly. He closed the archive window and opened the live session panel instead. Si vamos, he said automatically to the bakery worker, then corrected himself with a grin. Yes. Let's begin. For the rest of the class, he didn't think about the archive again. Not until the end of the night. At 8, they wrapped up. Chairs scraped, polite farewells were exchanged, coats were pulled on. One by one, the adults thanked him and stepped out into the drizzle. You locked door? Asked the grandmother, pausing near the threshold. Yes, Adam said. I'm the last one out. See you Thursday. When the door clicked shut, the room felt abruptly larger. The worn headphones hung in crooked arcs from their hooks. The air carried the faintest warmth from 20 breathing bodies, now fading. He returned to the console to log out. On the screen, the digital map of the lab still showed one booth active. Booth 13 glowed a soft, clear green. He stared at it, brows knitting. He'd watched each of his students leave. The lights above the booths were off, The only illumination came from the ceiling fixtures and the glow of his monitor. The status line at the bottom of the screen read, "Active channels. 1. Booth 13. Mic. On. Headphones. Connected." "Must be a glitch," he murmured. He clicked on booth 13 to disconnect it. The square flickered once, turned amber, then returned to steady green. The status remained unchanged. He stood, looking across the rows of carols, counting. The booths were numbered with small labels on white tape, 10 on each side. 13 would be there. Fourth on the left in the second row. It looked like all the others. Wooden side panels, scuffed desktop, a pair of headphones resting on the hook, their cord coiled loosely. The chair was pushed in. Adam walked down the aisle, his footsteps softened by the thin carpet. As he approached booth 13, he felt a slight chill, as if the air conditioning vent above were aimed more directly there, though he knew the system didn't work that way. He rested his hand lightly on the back of the chair and looked at the headset. The plastic ear cups were smooth under a faint layer of dust. No one had used this station in several weeks. He usually seated students closer to the front, where it was easier to see their faces. The tiny indicator light on the microphone boom glowed a very faint red. He hadn't turned that on. He reached out and tapped the small rectangular switch on the cord to off. The light went dark. Back at the console, booth 13's square stayed green. He tried again to disconnect it from the software. This time, a small dialog box appeared, almost reluctantly. "Unable to terminate session in use." "But it isn't," he said aloud. On the far side of the room, a faint crackle sounded in one of the ceiling speakers. Not loud, just the brief static pop a system makes when a channel opens. Then, very softly, as if from the end of a long hallway, came a voice. "Repeat, the weather is cloudy." The phrase was slow, careful. The words rounded, with the particular rhythm of someone reading from a line on a worksheet. Adam froze. The room was empty. He could see each booth from where he Saturday. No one sat hunched over a headset. No mouth moved. Yet the voice, young, somewhere in that uncertain age between child and teenager, continued. "The weather is cloudy. The weather is sunny." A pause. "Sunny. Sunny." He flicked the main volume knob on the console down instinctively. The voice dropped, but did not vanish. The signal bar beside booth 13 still rose and fell with each word. He leaned closer to the console microphone. "Hello?" he said, feeling slightly foolish. "Booth 13? For a heartbeat." Silence. Then, in the same flat, repeating tone, the voice said, "Hello. Booth 13. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. Maybe, he thought, an old recording was stuck in the system. Some ancient exercise looping. He checked the playback panel. No files were listed as playing. The timer for the session sat at an impossibly high number. No minutes, no hours, just a peppering of dashes. He listened again. "The date is October 12th. The date is October 12th. Adam glanced involuntarily at his phone on the desk. The lock screen still showed the current date, November 8. He swallowed. His throat felt dry. "Who is this?" he asked into the console mic, his voice softer. For the first time, the voice did not repeat him exactly. There was a faint rustle, like clothing shifting near a microphone. Then, haltingly, in accented but understandable English, "Teacher, I am late." Something in the way the last word stretched made his stomach tighten. He looked again at the list of archived sessions he had seen earlier. Session, Oct 12, Spanish 2, Teacher ID, RM Klein. Session, Essel Night, no date, no teacher. He scrolled quickly until he found the ESL entry again and clicked it. The same small window popped up. Session open. Channels active. 1. Booth 13. His hand hovered over the End Session button. "Can you say your name?" he asked, using the same patient tone he used with his night students when they were shy. "My name is Adam. What is your name?" A pause. A breath that wasn't really a breath, more a small shift in the hiss of the line. Then, "My name is Lena." He typed the letters before he fully realized he was doing it. Lina. They matched nothing in his current roster. He checked the list of old patrons in the library catalog in his mind, remembering a story about records decades old. No connection. Different wing, different system. How long have you been in booth 13, Lena? He asked, hearing how strange the question sounded. The reply came after a longer hesitation. Bell rang, she said in that careful textbook rhythm. I came from science. I am. A soft click, as if a finger tapped the side of the mic. Late. He imagined, unbidden, a girl in a too large sweatshirt hurrying down a hallway toward this very room, hearing the bell for the evening class, and wishing not to stand out any more than she already did. It's all right to be late, he said, though he wasn't sure if comfort could travel over whatever distance lay between his world and hers. Class is over for tonight. You can go home. The ambient hiss in the speaker shifted, like fabric scraping a chair. Home, she repeated. Walk home. Alone. Teacher says. Her voice drifted into a tangle of words he couldn't quite catch. Street names, maybe. Times. Then, more distinctly, rain. Very dark. Outside his own building, the November drizzle had thickened into rain. It pattered steadily on the flat roof above. He glanced at the clock. 8:23 p.m. Lena, he said quietly, what year is it? He hadn't meant to ask it. It sounded like something from a movie, but it was out now. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible click, as if a tape deck somewhere in the wiring had reached the end of its side. Then, 1984. The fluorescent lights above him hummed on, indifferent. He let out a slow, shaking breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The ESL sessions in the archive had no year. But the Spanish 2-entry October 12th would have had one, once. The system might have dropped it in a later update. Or it might never have been entered. He thought of the aging bulletin board in the hallway, where old club photos yellowed at the edges. Somewhere in those stacked years, a girl named Lena might have walked the same floors, sat in the same booths, practiced the same phrases. Lena, he said, still as gently as he could. I think class is finished. You don't have to stay in booth 13 anymore. You can take off the headset. Silence, except for the faint hiss. He heard, or thought he heard, the distant echo of another teacher's voice beneath it, giving instructions in some old, well-worn lesson. Repeat after me. The date is October 12th. The two tracks overlapped, the old instructions and the girl's hesitant breathing. Teacher, she said finally, her voice smaller, less formal. Outside. I do not know the words. Here I know. His chest tightened at that. He understood, perhaps too well, the pull of a small, contained space where rules were clear and expectations simple. In the booth, she repeated what was given to her. Out in the dark, language turned slippery. There are more words now, he said, new ones, different ones. Maybe you can learn them somewhere else. He realized he was talking to someone who might be nothing more than a fragment of an old recording trapped in a loop. But as he spoke, the signal bar on booth 13's panel steadied, no longer jittering with each breath. Can you say, he tried, I am going now? She hesitated. I am going now, she repeated. Good, he said, relief and an inexplicable sadness washing through him at once. You did very well. Thank you for coming to class. There was a soft sound then, the audio equivalent of someone taking off a pair of headphones and setting them down. A tiny scrape, a sliding thump. The indicator light for booth 13 on his console flickered, then dimmed to gray. The status line updated. Active channels, 0. He stayed where he was for a full minute, waiting to see if the light would return, if the ghostly line of speech would resume. It did not. Finally, he shut down the software, logged off, and gathered his things. At the door, he looked back at the rows of carrels. Booth 13 sat as it always had, as if nothing had ever happened. He switched off the lights. The room fell into shadow, the outlines of headsets like small listening shapes against the pale of the desks. The hallway outside was nearly dark. Only emergency lights glowed. He locked the lab door, checked it twice, and walked toward the side exit, his footsteps echoing. As he passed the bulletin board by the stairwell, something caught his eye. Behind the current flyers and printed notices, a corner of an older paper protruded. The edge was yellowed, brittle. Without fully deciding to, he reached up and peeled back the newer sheets on top. A black and white photo, slightly curled, stared back at him from behind the glass. It showed a group of students, clustered around a cake on a table. The caption at the bottom read, "ESL Night Class, Community Celebration, Fall 1984. The faces were small but not indistinct. Older women. Men in work shirts. A couple of teenagers. On the far right, almost out of frame, a girl in a sweatshirt looked toward the camera with a half smile, as if surprised to be included. The name list beneath the photo was too faded to read properly. Only a few letters here and there showed through. INAR. He stepped back, heart thudding. The security guard met him near the front desk as he signed out. "All good?" the guard asked. "Yeah," Adam said, forcing his voice steady. "Just the usual." He drove home through the rain with the lab's faint echo still in his ears. After that night, he made a quiet change to how he ran the evening class. He never seated anyone in booth 13. If a student's hand strayed toward that headset, he would suggest another spot. "Better sound over here," he'd say. Or, "That one's a bit glitchy." No one ever argued. Once, months later, curiosity won over caution, and he opened the lab software's archive tab again. The ESL night session still appeared on the list. This time, when he clicked it, the status read, "Session closed. Channels active. 0. The date field, which had been blank before, now showed a line of numbers, so faint he had to lean close to read them. Arlingbassen Sharid. He closed the window without hitting delete. Newer teachers came to Crestview. The district eventually replaced half the lab with newer computers. Some of the old booths were removed entirely, leaving gaps and a strangely stubborn hesitation to touch the unplugged carrel that had once been booth 13. Every now and then, a faint, ghostly voice would creep into someone's headset, mid-exercise. A few scattered words that didn't match the script. "The weather is," or, "Hello, teacher." Then the channel would click, and the current student's nervous repetition would resume. On those nights, if Adam happened to be in the building late, walking past the old lab on his way to copy something, he would slow his steps for a moment and listen. The hum of the equipment, the murmur of new learners, the echo of drills from years before all braided together in the closed, windowless room. Class was still in session, in its own way, and somewhere in the long, invisible network of wires running through Crestview's walls, one more session had finally, quietly, been allowed to end. Story number 6. The pool wing always felt separated from the rest of the school, even during the day. It sat at the far end of Jefferson High, tucked past the gym and down a short, echoing hallway. A set of heavy glass doors opened into the natatorium, a cavernous room of blue-tiled walls, bright overhead lights, and the smell of chlorine that never quite left your clothes. During the school day, it was busy with physical education classes and the swim team. After dinner, community members came for lap swim and lessons. And then at 9 o'clock, the last swimmer left, and the room belonged to the water and the hum of the filters. Jonah worked the closing shift 3 nights a week. He was in his mid-20s, working his way through community college. The pool job paid just enough to keep gas in his car and textbooks on his desk. He liked the predictability of it, the tick of the big clock on the wall, the clean lines of the lane stretching away, the way sound carried in the high space. By the time he started, he was the only lifeguard on evenings. "Budget cuts," his manager had said with a shrug. "You close up, lock the exterior doors, hand off to the building custodian if he's still around." Pretty simple. Most nights it was. He watched the lap swimmers in their steady circuits. He checked the chemical levels, backwashed the filters, put away the kickboards and pull buoys. When the last person left through the side door and the latch clicked, the pool quieted in a way he found oddly soothing. The first time something felt off, it was subtle enough to ignore. It was early winter. The kind of night when dark fell before most people had finished their workday. The outside windows showed only his beat and see lease aver, own reflection, and the thin line of parking lot lights beyond. The air in the natatorium was warm and slightly humid. A thin haze rose off the surface of the water, stirred by the vents. At 8:55 p.m., the last regular, a retired teacher who did slow, exact breaststroke, climbed the ladder in lane 2, nodded a good night, and headed toward the locker rooms. Jonah did his usual slow scan from one end of the pool to the other. No one else in the water. No one sitting on the deck. He blew his whistle once. "Pool is closed," he called, more out of habit than necessity. The big wall clock ticked over to 9. He walked the length of the deck, checking lane lines, skimmers, and the starting blocks at the deep end. The scoreboard above the far wall, dark and blank most of the time, showed only its small manufacturer's logo in a corner. As he reached the shallow end, a soft splash sounded behind him. Not the soft gel of a filtration jet, not a drop from the ceiling. Something had entered or left the water with a small, clean break. He turned, scanning the lanes. The surface lay smooth, except where the vents ruffled it in gentle patterns. No ripples ran the length of any lane as they would if someone had just pushed off. The empty lifeguard chair stood where he had left it. He squinted at the far end. The starting block's white platforms with numbers on their sides cast short shadows on the tiles. Block 4 had a tiny bead of water hanging at one corner, catching the light. He frowned. No one had used lane 4 since the early part of the evening. He would have seen. That lane stayed strangely unpopular. People chose 1, 2, 3, then jumped to 5 or 6, even when it meant crowding. Old pipes, he told himself, and turned back to roll the lane ropes closer to the edge. The noise came again on Thursday. This time he was sure no one else had been in the water for at least 10 minutes. He had watched the last 2 teenagers from the swim club finish their sprints, throw their towels over their shoulders, and vanish into the locker room. The building's clock system chimed faintly through the vents, an echo of the main hallway bell striking the hour elsewhere. He walked past the deep end, eyes drifting briefly to the series of team photos framed along the wall. 10 years of swim squads, their faces turned toward the camera in versions of the same pose. Different haircuts, different swimsuits, same proud, damp smiles. He tapped the filter gauge with one finger, checking the pressure. Behind him, water moved. It was the distinct, rolling push of a lap starting, followed by the gentle slap of a kick. It spun around. Lane 4's surface shivered not a big wave, but a subtle, linear motion, as if someone had just slid beneath it. The lane line bumped softly against its floats. The rest of the pool remained glassy. Jonah stared, whistle between his fingers, waiting for something obvious. A head breaking the surface, a hand grabbing the edge. Nothing happened. The ripples smoothed. The pool returned to its placid blue rectangle. He walked to the edge and looked down. The deep end fell away beneath him, the painted black line on the floor leading out of sight. The underwater lights made the bottom look slightly farther away than it really was. His own reflection shimmered, fractured into wavering pieces. Lane 4's marker tile caught his eye, a small, square ceramic with a bold black 4 glazed into it. It felt, in that moment, more like a label on a door than a number on the floor. He shook off the thought. Jets, he muttered. Just the Jets. The next week, more things began to line up around that particular lane. He noticed that the kickboard stacked by the shallow end almost always ended with one sticking out a bit farther, pointing toward lane 4. The rubber training fins he and the coach had gathered at the end of practice somehow migrated closer to that lane's edge, even when he'd left them in a neat pile near lane 2. The whiteboard by the entrance, where the coach wrote out the swim sets for the team, began to show faint remnants of older, erased practice plans underneath the fresh ones. Sometimes, before he wiped it clean at closing, he thought he could see an extra line of cramped handwriting in a different color. 4x200 IM. Lane 4 only. The coach, a practical man in his 50s, once caught him squinting. Forgotten how to read intervals? He joked. Do you ever use just lane 4 for anything? Jonah asked, trying to keep his voice light. The coach shrugged. Not really. Used to set up special sets there for one of our early swimmers. Talent beyond the rest. She liked the 4th lane. Said it felt the right distance from the wall. He chuckled softly. Routine matters, I guess. His face closed a little, the way people's expressions do when they realize they've neared a subject they don't like to discuss. What happened to her? Jonah asked, then immediately regretted it. Graduated, the coach said, a fraction too quickly. Moved on. Like they all do. After he left, Jonah glanced at the team photos again. In the 3rd frame from the left, the one dated 8 years ago, he found a girl in the middle row wearing a cap, tilted slightly askew. Her eyes crinkled at the corners as if she'd been laughing just before the shutter clicked. Someone had written a name under the picture in thin marker. Alina-4. The next Thursday, the pool felt heavier than usual. It had snowed during the day, and the cold outside pressed against the windows. The natatorium's industrial heaters worked harder, humming louder. The water steamed gently, its surface a soft blur in the far lanes. Lap swim was light. Many of the regulars had stayed home, cautious about the icy roads. By 8:30, only one person remained, a man doing slow backstroke in lane 1. He finished at 8:45, nodded thanks, and left. Jonah was alone with the empty pool, 15 minutes earlier than usual. He sat for a moment in the lifeguard chair at the deep end, enjoying the quiet. The sound of the filters and the distant thrum of the building's boilers mixed into a steady backdrop. The big scoreboard above the far wall flickered. It wasn't much, just a brief pulse, as if the power had surged. The manufacturer's logo in the corner blinked out and back in. Jonah frowned and checked the panel on the wall that controlled it. All the switches were where they should be. The on light glowed soft green. He looked back up. Numbers had appeared where there had been none. Lane 4, 0:25, 17. The time ticked up, second by second. 18, 19, 20. As if running from zero in real time. No other lanes showed anything. Jonah stared at the display. A thin prickle of unease crept along his arms. He scanned the water. Lane 4 lay still. No disturbance, no swimmer. The starting blocks were dry. He climbed down from the chair and walked over to the control box mounted on the wall. He flipped the main switch off. For a moment, the scoreboard obeyed. The numbers vanished. The green indicator light dimmed. Then, with a quiet click, the scoreboard turned itself back on. The logo flickered. The lane time for 4 resumed from where it had left off, as if the interruption had never happened. 0:26:83, 0:26:84. The rest of the lanes remained dark. The whistle cord cut a light line against his palm as he tightened his grip. The natatorium's door at the far end thumped once, quietly, as if someone had pushed it with their shoulder and found it locked. Jonah walked slowly to the edge of lane 4 and crouched. The smell of chlorine rose more strongly there, or maybe he was just closer to it now. "Is somebody still swimming?" he said under his breath, feeling absurd and yet unable to stop the words. Tiny ripples kissed the tile by his shoes, though no visible cause disturbed the middle of the lane. It was the kind of motion you'd see if someone under the surface trailed their fingers along the bottom, lightly dragging them back and forth. The scoreboard's timer jumped, the digits blurring for a second. Then they settled not on a continuing time, but on a fixed one. Lane 4, 1, 2, 4. Next to it, faintly, a small label flickered into being. Text that the old scoreboard model shouldn't have been able to display at all. Practice. He remembered the coach's offhand story. Special sets in lane 4. A swimmer named Elena. He looked back at the photo in his mind, her crooked cap. The number pressed on her suit. His heart beat faster, crowding his breath. "Practice is over," he said, voice steady only through effort. Pools closed. The timer froze. The word practice blinked once, then faded. The water in lane 4 stilled completely, as if someone had stopped mid-stroke and let go. He stayed crouched there for a long minute, watching the surface. Finally he stood, turned off the legitimate power to the scoreboard again, and watched until the digits went utterly dark. This time, they stayed that way. He spent the rest of the closing routine moving a little quicker than usual. After that night, Jonah started taking more notice of the details in the pool wing, the racket of the old ventilation fans, the way one tile near lane 4's edge had a hairline crack that never quite seemed to grow or mend, the whiteboard's tendency to show extra ghost lines of old workout sets when the evening moisture rose. He also noticed something else. On nights when he heard faint splashes after the date closing, the clock on the wall near the door always seemed to read 9:04 p.m., no matter what his watch said. Spring arrived. The days stretched later. The swim team went to regionals. Plaques were added to the hallway display, small brass plates under photos noting records and championships. One afternoon, walking through on his way to an early shift, Jonah saw a framed clipping he hadn't paid attention to before. It hung a little awkwardly at the end of the trophy case. The newsprint yellowed. "Local swimmer honored after medical scare," the headline read. He scanned the text. During an evening practice at Jefferson High School's pool last fall, it said, "Varsity swimmer Elena R. experienced a serious medical episode in the water. Quick response by teammates and staff, along with fast-arriving emergency personnel, prevented tragedy. Elena has since recovered fully, but has decided to step away from competitive swimming. The team has retired her lane number 4 in recognition of her dedication. Jonah let the paper fall back against the wall, his hand lingering on the frame for a second. Retired her lane. No official plaque by the pool mentioned it. No sign hung over the block. But the habit had stuck. People avoided lane 4, without knowing why. Except, it seemed, for one presence that had never quite left. The last week of school, the district announced that the pool would be closing for an extended period for renovations. Possibly a year, the email said. Maybe longer, depending on funding. There was talk that it might not reopen at all, that the space might be converted to something else. Last chance to enjoy the water, Jonah told the evening regulars with a half smile. The night before the closure, the coach held an informal farewell practice, with the few swimmers still in town. They did relaxed sets, more splashing and joking than drilling. At the end, they all lined up on the deck for a photo. Jonah, standing by the entrance, heard the coach say quietly, "Leave lane 4 open," when someone moved to stand in front of it. After everyone left, and the echoes of laughter had faded down the hall, the pool fell into its deepest quiet. Jonah turned off the overhead lights and stages, leaving only the underwater lamps and the dim yellow of the exit signs. The water glowed an unreal blue-green, shadows pooling in the corners of the room. He walked once around the deck, checking that everything was stowed. The kickboards in their rack, the rescue tube hooked on its peg, the long pole with the net resting where it belonged. Near the deep end, a small object caught his eye, half tucked under the lane rope. A swim cap, pale blue, with a slightly faded black number printed on its side. See. He picked it up. The rubber was dry but not brittle. No one from the current team used that color. Their caps were a different shade, with a newer logo. He turned it over. On the inside, in thin permanent marker, a name had been written years ago. Elena. A distant whistle blew the thin, ghostly sound of a lifeguard's call from somewhere in the past, vibrating faintly through the tiles. Jonah closed his hand around the cap, felt the smooth material crease. The surface of the water stirred. Not dramatically. No waves crashed. But in lane 4, a rhythmic pattern began, as if someone were pushing off from the wall again and again, moving up and down the lane in invisible lengths. The underwater lights threw shifting bands of illumination as something unseen sliced through. On the far wall, though he had not turned the scoreboard back on, digits flickered to life. Lane 4, warm-up. 8x50 easy. The letters struggled to form, some lines of each segment failing, but the intent was there. He stood at the edge by block 4, the cap still in his hand, and watched the water move. His reflection shivered alongside the phantom lane pattern. "All right," he said quietly, the way a coach might speak to a lone swimmer finishing a set. "Last practice. Then the pool's closing. You don't have to stay here every night anymore." The ripples continued, unbroken. He took the cap and set it carefully on the starting block, smoothing it flat. "I know you like this lane," he went on. "You earned that. But there's nowhere else for you to race here now. No more meets. No more late practices. It's okay to be done." His voice sounded small in the big space, but it didn't vanish. It settled on the water. The invisible pattern in lane 4 shifted. For a few seconds, the movement grew stronger, as if someone had picked up their pace. Faster turns, quicker kicks. The lane line trembled lightly. The non-existent coach's whistle blew again, slightly nearer. On the scoreboard, the words warm-up changed. Main set, last one. Then, slowly, the numbers under lane 4 began to count down instead of up. 0.10分, 0.09分, 0.08分. Jonah's pulse matched it, strangely. He found himself holding his breath. When the timer reached 0, the water stilled. No final splash, no triumphant cheer. Just a quiet smoothing, the kind that happens when a swimmer grabs the wall and rests their forehead against their arm. Breath slowing. The scoreboard's digits flickered once, desperately thin, then spelled out one last, brief word before going dark. Done. The faint smell of chlorine thickened in his nose. Or maybe it was the sting of tears he hadn't expected. He stood there, listening. No more unseen laps traced the water. The lane lines lay calm. The cap on block 4 stayed where he had placed it, its printed number facing the pool. After a long minute, he picked it back up. On impulse, he walked to the small office off the deck, opened the narrow supply cabinet where lost and found items collected over months, goggles, towels, stray flip-flops, and placed the cap on the top shelf. Saved, he said, though there was no one to record it on a list. He turned out the underwater lights, one switch at a time. The natatorium faded into shadow, the pool settling into a dark, still rectangle. In the silence that followed, he could almost hear very faintly the sound of someone hauling themselves out of the deep end, water streaming off their arms, footsteps slapping lightly toward a door that existed only in the past. The renovations began the next week. Contractors came with drills and scaffolds. The water was drained, leaving the pool a dry, echoing basin of cracked paint and echoes. They talked about leveling part of it for multi-purpose space, maybe a smaller lap area if funds allowed. Workers sometimes said, in low voices over coffee, that on certain early mornings, before the machines really started up, they could hear the phantom lapping of water on tile, even though the pool lay empty. One electrician swore the scoreboard had flashed on briefly one day, displaying a single lane time for an event that wasn't configured on the new panel at all. The coach retired a year later. The team disbanded, or absorbed into a nearby facilities program. The trophies were boxed and sent to storage. The framed clipping about the scare during practice stayed in its slightly crooked spot in the hallway, overlooked but not removed. Years after Jonah left Jefferson, visiting town on an errand, he drove past the school and saw lights on in the old pool wing. Curiosity pulled him inside. The natatorium had changed. Part of the floor had been filled in and retiled. A smaller, shallow training pool occupied one end, with bright new starting blocks and a brand new scoreboard. Colorful murals of waves and fish covered the walls. In a corner near the equipment room, on a small hook beside a row of spare caps, hung an older, slightly faded blue swim cap with a black 4 on it. A teen swimmer grabbed it without thinking as she hurried to practice, then paused. "Is this one okay?" she called to the new coach. "It looks old." The coach glanced over. "Oh, that one? Someone left it here years ago. It's kind of a mascot now. If you wear it, you have to lead your lane." She smiled. "Big responsibility." The girl grinned and pulled it on, tugging the edges over her ears. "I can lead," she said. When the starter beeped and the swimmers dove, Lane 4 cut through the water just a fraction cleaner than the others, as if guided by a practiced hand that remembered every tile on the bottom. No one saw the faint shadow that surfaced once, just beside the block, and then eased away, as if finally satisfied that someone else could take the lane. In the deep of the building, where tiles met old concrete and pipes carried the memory of countless gallons of water, the echoes of unseen practice settled at last into the rest of the school's nighttime. Sounds another pattern in the endless, quiet lapse of a place that never truly slept. Story number 7. By day, the main office of Westfield Middle School was a busy crossroads. Phones rang, printers chattered. Students came in with bandaged knees or late slips or forms clutched in their hands. Secretaries moved in a practiced rhythm behind the long counter, shuffling papers and typing attendance codes. At night, without that bustle, the office looked strangely like a stage set that had forgotten its actors. On the night it happened, the last week of November, the building had already been through a long day. Parent-teacher conferences had stretched into the evening. Families had lined the halls, warmed by the smell of coffee from the staff lounge and the soft buzz of tired conversation. By 8:30, most of them had gone home. Teachers carried stacks of folders out to their cars. The parking lot lights glowed in the light drizzle. Inside, the main office lights still burned. Amrita Kaur sat at the front desk, rubbing at a spot on her wrist where the watch band pressed. She was in her first year at Westfield, teaching 7th grade English, and she had agreed perhaps too eagerly to stay late and help with the new attendance system. "They're pushing for total reconciliation before the end of the trimester," the assistant principal had said, handing her a folder. "We have to make sure every absence is coded, every late slip logged. If you don't mind helping Gloria finish, we'd really appreciate it." Gloria, the head secretary, had smiled wearily at her from behind her monitor. "You'll be my hero if we can clear these tonight," she had said, tapping the pile of pink and yellow slips in her tray. By 9 o'clock, the slips were sorted, and the office was quiet. The assistant principal had waved goodnight an hour earlier. The school nurse had left with a box of unclaimed inhalers. Even the janitorial cart had moved on down the hallway. "Go home, honey," Gloria said finally, pushing back from her chair with a small groan. "Your eyes are going to cross if you look at that screen much longer. I'm locking up." Amrita shook her head. "I'll just finish entering my homeroom's tardies. It's easier if I do it now while I remember." Gloria hesitated, hand on her purse strap. "The alarm arm's at 10, she said. "You know the code?" "Yes," Amrita said. "And the custodian is still here, right?" "I saw his cart by the science wing." "Probably," Gloria said, though she sounded unsure. "All right, don't stay too long. These walls start creaking after dark." She flipped off the light in her small inner office and left through the staff entrance, her footsteps fading down the side corridor. The door latch clicked. For a moment, Amrita simply sat at the big front desk and listened. The main office was a broad rectangle with low-slung fluorescent lights and pale blue walls. The long counter faced the lobby. Its glass doors dark now. On one side, a row of student chairs lined the wall under a framed photograph of the original school building, taken sometime in the 1970 seconds. Along the back wall, doors led to the principal's office, the nurse, and a narrow room marked attendance. The computer screen in front of her glowed with the district's new software. A grid of names and dates, tiny icons marking absences, tardies, early dismissals. She scrolled through until she found her homeroom and began entering codes. The building around her made its own small nocturnal noises, the distant whoosh of air through vents, the faint clank of a pipe somewhere in the ceiling. Now and then, a dull thud carried down the hallway as a door closed at the far end of the school. She lost herself in the rhythm of the work. Click, type, tab, down arrow. A student who was sick in October. Another whose bus was chronically late. A handful of unexplained absences marked U in red. She was halfway through November when the intercom crackled. The sudden sound made her jump, fingers flying from the keyboard. The ceiling speaker in the corner of the office hissed, then popped softly. "Attention, please," a voice said. It was not the principal's voice, or the assistant's, or Gloria's. It was a neutral, slightly flattened tone, like a recorded announcement. The sound was thin and distant, as if it had come down a long line. "Afternoon attendance will now be taken," it said. "Teachers, please, record all absent students and send slips to the main office." The hair along Amrita's arms lifted. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The red second hand moved steadily past the 9:17 p.m. "Must be a glitch," she murmured. Maybe the system had a scheduled announcement stuck in its memory. The intercom clicked off. The office fell quiet again. She stared at the blank square speaker for a moment longer, then shook her head and went back to the computer. Her own heartbeat sounded a little too loud in her ears. A minute later, the attendance software stuttered. The window dimmed briefly, then brightened. A small box appeared in the corner of the screen. "Sync error. Server unavailable. Switching to local backup." The list of names blurred. For 2 or 3 seconds, the monitor went gray. Then a different interface appeared, one she had never seen. It was simpler, made of rectangles and lines with very plain text, like an old program that hadn't been updated in years. At the top, in blocky letters, it read, "Westfield Middle, roll call, date, period, homeroom." Below, rows of names scrolled down, arranged by homeroom section. Many were familiar, her current students. Others were not. Names that didn't appear on any of her rosters. Rainey, L. McCormick, J. Lopez, F. Mendes, A. Next to each name, 2 small boxes sat side by side. Present and absent. Some were filled with a dark check mark in one, some in the other. Some were empty. She frowned, hand hovering near the mouse. "Where did you come from?" she asked the screen under her breath. The building seemed to listen. From the hallway outside the office, a faint creak sounded, as if one of the bulletin boards had shifted on its hooks. A moment later, very softly, the bell tone chimed a single, subdued ding that usually signaled the start of homeroom at exactly 8:05 a.m. It was nowhere near 8:05. Amrita stood, the wheeled chair rolling back a few inches. The lobby outside the glass doors was empty. The security lights in the hallway cast long strips of illumination on the floor. No footsteps echoed. No voices murmured. She forced herself to sit back down. "You're tired," she told herself quietly. "This system updated and glitched, that's all." On the monitor, one of the blank checkboxes flickered. Slowly, as if an invisible cursor moved across it, a tiny dark mark appeared in the present box beside a name she didn't recognize. Hartley, S. The air in the office shifted, its temperature not changing so much as its density. The space felt a fraction more occupied. A soft sound came from the row of student chairs along the wall, the faint creak of weight settling into one, then another, as if some of the seats had just been taken. Amrita's throat tightened. She turned her head. The chairs were empty, lined up in their usual neat row. The photograph of the original decades-old building hung straight above them. The glass in the frame reflected only the fluorescent lights. In that reflection, for the briefest of moments, she thought she saw shapes sitting in the chairs. 4 or 5 hunched outlines, shoulders bent, hands folded in their laps. The impression of faces turned toward the front desk. She blinked. The reflection showed only chairs. Her cursor hovered over the software's strange checkboxes. "Maybe if I close it," she said quietly, more to feel her own voice in the room than anything. She clicked the small X in the corner of the window. Nothing happened. The mouse pointer moved. The red X icon highlighted. But the window stayed open. Its list of names steady. A message, pale and nearly transparent, appeared at the bottom. "Attendance in progress. Do not exit." The intercom crackled again overhead. "Teachers," the same neutral voice said, "please verify your role and send any missing names to the main office." A new column materialized to the right of the list on her screen, labeled late. Next to some of the names, a faint, blinking underline appeared, waiting. In the hallway, a locker door slammed somewhere. The sound carried the length of the empty corridor. Then another, more distant. Amrita's skin prickled with a cold that had nothing to do with the building's air. She stood abruptly and walked to the doorway, leaning out just far enough to see down the central spine of the school. The long hallway stretched both ways, lockers closed, posters pinned to the walls, classroom doors shut. At the far end, the red exit sign glowed. The digital clock above it read 9:19. Directly above her, the hallway speaker sat in its metal grill. For a second, she heard it. The faint, shuffling murmur of many feet on linoleum. The buzz of voices, all very far away. Then it faded, as if someone had turned down a volume knob. She stepped back into the office and shut the door. The computer waited for her, its glow steady. Without meaning to, she read down the unfamiliar names. Some carried a weight of recognition she couldn't place. A few matched old plaques she'd seen in the trophy case. A last name here, a first name there. Near the bottom of the current page, a name blinked in the late column, its underline insistent. Elena R. Present. Checked. Absent. Late. The assistant principal had told her, in a careful, half-finished sentence during orientation, that the school had been through a difficult time, one year when a beloved student had experienced a health crisis. It had been years ago, before her time. "We have strong emergency procedures now," he had added quickly. "You'll hear about them in training." He had not given a name. She stared at the line on the screen until the letters seemed to float. The late underline blinked faster. "Teacher," the intercom voice said, softer now, as if sampled from a recording played at low volume. "Please send late students to the main office." The hallway speaker echoed it faintly, warped by distance. A faint tapping sounded at the glass doors leading from the office to the lobby. Not loud, just the light, uncertain rap of knuckles that weren't sure if anyone would answer. Her pulse picked up. She turned her head slowly. No one stood in the lobby. The doors reflected only the desk and the fluorescent strip above. But near the bottom of the glass, at the level of a seated student's knees, a small, blurred handprint bloomed briefly, as if pressed from the other side. The moisture of it, or something like moisture, spread, then faded. Amrita realized she was holding her breath. "I'm not doing this," she said quietly, fingers curling against her palms. "I'm not taking attendance for people who aren't here." The check mark beside Hartley, S, flickered, as if offended. Another name farther down, one she didn't recognize at all. shifted from present to absent on its own. The empty chairs along the wall creaked again, one after another, tiny sounds in order, like someone leaning forward, then back. The air felt unbearably still. She thought suddenly of the small room marked attendance behind her. In the daytime, just a cramped space where a clerk printed late slips and answered parent calls. At night, it was dark, its glass window a blank square in the wall. She had never stepped inside it after hours. Without fully deciding, she found herself crossing the office and reaching for its door handle. It turned easily. The lights came on with a soft click. The room was narrow, lined with low file cabinets and shelves weighed down by binders. A desk sat under the window that opened onto the main office, its rolling chair pushed in. On the back wall, an old-fashioned metal flipboard hung in a frame, the kind where you slid letters into grooves. It was blank. A thin layer of dust coated its edge. On the desk, however, lay an object out of place among the modern printouts and the computer monitor. A large, heavy attendance book bound in dark green cloth. Its corners were worn. Its pages bulged slightly, the way paper does when it has absorbed years of handling. Amrita stepped closer. The book was open to a half-filled page. 2 columns ran down the paper. Name and status. The dates at the top spanned several years, each written in different inks and hands. Many lines had been crossed out. Some were checked. A few trailed off mid-letter. One entry at the very bottom of the page stood alone, written more recently in a careful, steady script. Car. A. Pending. She stared at it. Her first thought was that someone was playing a joke. Someone in the office, bored, had written her name there the day she was hired, intending to show it to her later and laugh. But the ink had sunk slightly into the fibers of the paper. The line above bore a date from 3 years earlier. Someone had used this book slowly, over a long time. Behind her, out in the main office, the computer chimed softly. Another checkbox must have filled itself. Another name logged. A narrow rectangular slot near the bottom of the attendance room's far wall caught her eye. She hadn't noticed it before. It was set low, just above the baseboard, with a metal flap. On the wall above it, a small brass label read, "Late divided by early pass. Return here." In the old days, she realized, before everything was electronic, students had probably slipped their paper passes back through from the hallway, where they would land in a tray inside. Now, the tray below the slot was empty. As she watched, the flap trembled. It lifted a fraction of an inch, then let go. Something brushed it from the other side, tentative. The faint scrape of paper on metal sounded. A soft, dragging hush. Then, with a small rustle, a folded slip slid through and dropped into the tray. Alone in the room, she listened to its edges settle against the plastic. Her skin felt too tight. She took one step forward and looked down. It was a standard Westfield late pass, the same pink cardstock the office used every day. The date line at the top was blank. So were the from and reason fields. Only the name line had been filled out. Name. A. Carr. The handwriting was not hers. Behind her, the intercom spoke once more. "Staff," the neutral voice said, fainter now, as if coming from farther away. "Please remember to sign out before leaving the building." The big clock in the main office ticked steadily. Its hands, she noticed, now both pointed directly at the 12. 9. Not 9:23, as her watch said. The red second hand did not move. Time in the office had decided on a loop. In front of her, the attendance book lay open with its one unresolved line. Cower. A. Pending. She picked up the pink pass. Its cardstock felt cool and ordinary. No chill, no static, just paper. She set it down on the desk next to the book, and with a slow breath, pulled a pen from the holder. "Okay," she said quietly, though she wasn't sure whether she was addressing the room, the building, or the invisible network of years woven through its walls. "Let's finish this properly." On the attendance page, beside her printed name, she wrote a neat word. Cleared. The ink looked as if it had always belonged there. In the tray below the pass slot, something small shifted. Another slip slid soundlessly into place. But she didn't look at it. She sensed, rather than saw, that it bore another name, one she did not know, and that the act of writing her own status had made space for someone else's to resolve. In the main office, the checkboxes on the strange backup screen flickered in her imagination, tiny marks aligning. She carried the attendance book back to the big desk and set it beside the keyboard. The computer's odd interface still showed its list. At the bottom, between two lines of unfamiliar students, a new entry had appeared. Staff, car, A, present. The late column beside her name was no longer blinking. It was filled with a small, dark dot, as if the system had registered her as having arrived, been accounted for, and released. The do not exit warning at the bottom faded, its letters thinning, then vanishing. A moment later, the old-style roll call window collapsed in on itself, the modern attendance software blooming back into place as if nothing had intruded. Server connection restored. A small note in the corner said, "Sync complete." Overhead, the intercom crackled one last time. "Dismissal," the neutral voice said softly, almost kindly. "All students and staff are dismissed." Somewhere deep in the building, a series of pop clicks traveled along the network of magnetic door holders as they released. The fire doors that had been shut after hours eased open slightly, the air shifting. The big clock's red second hand jumped and began to move again, sweeping past the 12. The minute hand twitched, then advanced. Outside in the hallway, a sound rose and then fell. The faint rush and murmur of many feet going home, of lockers opening and shutting, of after-school voices lifted and then fading as the air thinned. Amrita stood very still, her fingers resting on the desk. The chairs along the wall no longer creaked. The air in the office felt simply like air again. She shut down the computer. The monitor went dark, leaving only the reflection of the empty office. On impulse, she opened the attendance room door once more and glanced at the tray under the pass slot. Dozens of pink slips lay there now, stacked neatly, their edges aligned. Different names, different handwritings. Some new, some yellowed with age. On the top one, a name she had never heard was written in careful printed letters. Its timeline was filled in with a time that made no sense, decades before her birth. She did not disturb them. Instead, she reached for the heavy green book, flipped past her own resolved line, and saw that several entries above had been quietly completed in the same steady script as hers. Rainey, L cleared. McCormick, J cleared. Elena R, cleared. The dates beside them were blurred, refusing to settle into a single year. She closed the book gently and turned off the light in the attendance room. On her way out, she paused by the row of student chairs under the old photograph. In the glass, her reflection stood alone, but for a heartbeat, she thought she saw the outline of another figure beside hers, a teenager in a hoodie with a backpack slung over one shoulder, someone else in a worn jacket clutching a library book, a younger child swinging their feet just above the floor. Then the fluorescent lights flickered once, resetting her eyes, and the reflection settled. She walked through the lobby, keyed in the alarm code, and stepped out into the damp night. The door closed behind her with a solid, familiar thump. The parking lot was nearly empty. Her car sat under a street lamp, speckled with fine rain. As she crossed the asphalt, she heard, very faintly from inside the building, the echo of a bell. Not the harsh electronic tone of the modern system, but the softer ring of an older brass bell, the kind that might once have hung in the original school building in the photograph. It rang once, twice, then stopped. After that night, the attendance software never showed her the strange backup screen again. The intercom still glitched occasionally, playing half an announcement at odd hours, but the voice sounded more like interference than intention. Sometimes, when she stayed late grading papers at her classroom desk, she would hear the faint announcement of afternoon attendance at the wrong time of day and smile, just a little. "You're thorough," she would murmur to the empty room. "I'll give you that." One afternoon in spring, a new art teacher hung a series of student drawings in the main office. Scenes of the school from different angles. In one, the row of chairs beneath the old photograph was rendered in careful pencil. Several ghost-like outlines sat there, sketched so lightly they were almost invisible. When she commented on them, the student shrugged. "I kept starting and erasing," he said. "Felt like somebody should be sitting there. I don't know. Maybe that's dumb." "It's not dumb," she said. "It's accurate in its way." He looked at her oddly, then laughed and walked away. The heavy attendance book remained in the little room marked attendance. New secretaries cycled through. Some noticed it, some didn't. Every once in a while, during a drill or a real emergency when the building pulled its occupants into a single humming focus, someone might flip it open to the last page and find that another old name had quietly shifted from pending to cleared on its own. Westfield Middle School rang its bells each morning and each afternoon, just like any other school. But in the thin hours between, when the halls were empty and the lights were low, it sometimes seemed to take its own, slower roll call, tallying not just who was there now, but who had ever been, making sure that eventually, everyone was allowed to go home.